Welcome to Crime Bedtime, true crime stories to fall asleep to. Before we dive into tonight's cases, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from. Now get comfortable and let's begin. Story 1. The Dylan Millard Cases. On May 3, 2013, just after 9 o'clock in the evening, a man named Tim Bosma left his home in Ancaster, Ontario with two strangers who had come to test drive his black Dodge Ram pickup truck. His wife, Charlene, watched him drive off from their driveway. She never saw him again. Tim had listed the truck for sale online on platforms like Kijiji and AutoTrader. He mentioned to friends and family that he had a few prospective buyers lined up. The two men who showed up that night were among them. They said they were interested in buying the truck and wanted to take it for a quick spin. Tim, cautious but trusting, decided to go with them. He had told Charlene he'd be back soon. When he wasn't home by midnight, she called the police. The case was taken seriously right from the start. Within hours, police launched a missing persons investigation. By the next morning, they had already begun piecing together surveillance footage from the neighborhood and speaking to residents. What they found was unsettling. One neighbor's camera had captured the truck pulling out of the Bosma driveway with a second vehicle following close behind a dark-colored SUV. Possibly a Yukon or Suburban. That detail would become important later. The disappearance of Tim Bosma quickly became a national story. He was a young father, only 32 years old, with a wife and a 2-year-old daughter. He had no enemies, no known debts, no criminal history. Just an average guy selling a truck. The public appeal from Charlene Bosma pleading for her husband's safe return brought widespread attention and sympathy. Police received hundreds of tips and they followed up on each one. Soon, investigators discovered that two men had arranged to see the truck a day earlier but never showed up. Tim had mentioned this to a friend. That missed meeting started to align with some digital clues. Police tracked IP addresses and phone numbers used to contact Tim about the truck and began to zero in on a suspect, a man named Dylan Millard. Millard was not a typical suspect. He came from a wealthy, well-known aviation family in Canada. His grandfather had founded Millard Air, a charter airline and aviation maintenance company. Dylan himself was a licensed pilot by the age of 14, the youngest in Canadian history at the time. But by 27, he had taken over the family business after the death of his father, Wayne Millard, in what had been ruled a suicide in 2012. On May 10th, just 1 week after Tim Bosma vanished, Dylan Millard was arrested and charged with forcible confinement and theft over $5,000 in connection with the missing truck. Police had found Bosma's black Dodge Ram in a trailer parked at Millard's mother's home in Kleinburg. The truck had been stripped and partially cleaned. But it wasn't just the vehicle that raised alarm, it was what else they found on Millard's property that changed everything. Investigators executed search warrants on Millard's properties, including a sprawling farm in Ayr, Ontario. There, behind a barn, they made a chilling discovery. An industrial-grade incinerator, called the Eliminator, designed to cremate large animal remains. It had been recently used. Forensic testing later confirmed that human remains found inside the incinerator belonged to Tim Bosma. With that confirmation, the charges against Millard were upgraded to first-degree murder. A second man, Mark Smitch, was also arrested and charged. Smitch was a friend of Millard's, a small-time criminal and aspiring rapper from Oakville. He had a record for petty theft and drug possession, but nothing that suggested he'd be capable of murder. Yet, the evidence began piling up against both of them. Cell phone records placed both Millard and Smitch near the Bosma home on the night of the disappearance. Photos from Smitch's deleted phone data later recovered by police showed the pair posing with the black pickup truck. Another photo showed the incinerator with a caption that would later become a key piece of evidence in court. The prosecution would argue that the murder was premeditated. Millard and Smitch had allegedly targeted Bosma not just to steal his truck, but for the thrill of it. Surveillance footage showed Millard and Smitch scouting other vehicles in the days leading up to the murder. They had test-driven another Dodge Ram in Toronto just days before under false names. That man, fortunately, had not gone with them for the ride. The motive was harder to pin down. Millard was wealthy. He didn't need to steal a truck. But what police and prosecutors uncovered painted a disturbing picture of a man who had grown increasingly detached from reality, someone who saw himself as untouchable. Journal entries, song lyrics, and text messages revealed a fascination with violence and control. As the investigation deepened, so did the scope of Millard's potential crimes. While police were still building their case against him for the murder of Tim Bosma, questions began to surface about the death of his father, Wayne Millard. His death, in December 2012, had initially been ruled a suicide. He was found in bed with a gunshot wound to the head and a handgun nearby. There was no sign of forced entry, and Dellen had told police he found his father's body after returning home. At the time, it seemed open and shut. But with Millard now charged with murder, that assumption didn't feel so solid. Investigators re-examined the case. Forensic analysis revealed that the bullet entered Wayne Millard's eye at an unusual angle, one that would be difficult to self-inflict. More importantly, the gun had no fingerprints on it. And Millard's phone records showed he was at his father's home overnight, when he had claimed to be elsewhere. The Crown believed Millard killed his father to gain full control of the family fortune and business. Wayne had recently invested millions into expanding Millardair's operations into aircraft maintenance. But Dellen wasn't interested in running a legitimate company. He was draining the accounts and using the assets to fund his own hobbies: cars, women, and eventually murder. By the summer of 2013, Millard was facing 2 first-degree murder charges, one for Tim Bosma, and one under investigation for his father's death. But there was still another case to uncover. A missing woman, someone close to Millard, a former girlfriend who had vanished in 2012, months before Bosma's murder, and before his father's death. Her name was Laura Babcock, and her disappearance would lead police into the darkest part of Dellen Millard's life. In July of 2013, 2 months after Tim Bosma's murder, detectives with the Toronto Police Service quietly reopened a missing persons file that had received little attention the year before. It was the case of 23-year-old Laura Babcock, whose parents had reported her missing in July of 2012. At the time, she was thought to be struggling with mental health issues and housing instability, and authorities had not treated her disappearance as suspicious. But now, with Dellen Millard under arrest for murder, her name had surfaced again, only this time, in a context that was far more disturbing. Laura Babcock had been a close acquaintance of Millard's. Their relationship had been intermittent, emotionally intense at times, and marked by jealousy from both sides. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Laura had been in contact not only with Millard but also with his then-girlfriend, Christina Nudga. Text messages later obtained by investigators showed a growing tension. Laura had messaged Millard frequently, and in several messages, she referenced Christina directly challenging her, threatening to expose their continued contact. On June 26, 2012, Laura's phone activity abruptly ceased. Her final outgoing call was placed that evening. After that, there were no more texts, no data usage, no calls. Her banking activity stopped. She was never seen or heard from again. At the time, her parents had contacted police and filed a missing persons report. They said it was unlike their daughter to completely vanish. She had struggled. Yes, she had recently left university and had been couch surfing among friends. But she always checked in. She always responded to her family's messages. When that communication ended, they knew something was wrong. Initially, investigators treated the case as one involving a young adult voluntarily stepping out of contact. There were no signs of foul play. Friends gave conflicting reports about where she had last been staying. And without any financial trails or phone records that suggested movement, the file went cold. But once Millard was arrested, Toronto police took a closer look. They began with his phone records. A detailed analysis of call logs and text messages showed that in the days leading up to Laura's disappearance, Millard had been in frequent contact with her. The final message he sent to her was on July 3, 2012, after she had already stopped using her phone. In it, he wrote one sentence: "Deleted you from my life." Investigators then looked at his movements. Millard's phone pinged off towers that placed him in downtown Toronto on the evening of June 26th. Later that night, it moved westward, along the 401 highway corridor toward his farm in Ayr. That same night, so did the phone of Mark Smitch. Smitch's location data tracked alongside Millard's, and both devices were active near the farm until the early hours of the next morning. But it was what they found in Millard's digital files that drew the most attention. Among thousands of recovered documents, images, and notes, investigators discovered a photograph dated July 23, 2012. It showed the Eliminator incinerator positioned behind the barn on the Ayr property. Smoke was rising from its chimney. The photo had been taken with Millard's own phone. Just below it was a text file later found to be saved from a deleted messaging app. It contained a single line, "The bitch is gone. Goodbye, problem." That same file contained a to-do list with items like barn, barbecue, and a notation that simply read "Ambition completed." The list had been saved in the early morning hours of June 27th, roughly 12 hours after Laura's phone went dark. When police searched the incinerator again, they found additional bone fragments. Though most were too degraded for DNA analysis, forensic anthropologists were able to confirm that they belonged to a young adult human female. The fragments showed signs of thermal alteration consistent with high-temperature cremation. By April 2014, police had gathered enough evidence to charge Millard and Smitch with the first-degree murder of Laura Babcock. Though her body was never recovered in full, the forensic findings, combined with the digital evidence and timelines, formed a compelling case. The Crown's theory was that Laura had become an inconvenience. Her increasing communication with Millard, and her threats to expose his ongoing involvement with her to Christina Nudga, had reached a boiling point. The prosecution believed Millard devised a plan to eliminate her both literally and symbolically. What made the case even more chilling was how methodical it appeared. Prosecutors introduced evidence that Millard had purchased the industrial incinerator months earlier, in 2011. It had been shipped from the United States and delivered to his hangar at region of Waterloo International Airport. He later moved it to the farm. The machine cost more than $10,000 and was capable of reaching temperatures over 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit, sufficient to destroy bone. Alongside the photo evidence, text messages between Millard and Smitch revealed a language of detachment and euphemism. They rarely mentioned Laura by name. Instead, they used phrases like "the mission" and "the solution." In one recovered line, Smitch wrote, "We did good, bro." Millard responded, "No more drama." The court also heard from several of Laura's friends. One woman testified that Laura had confided in her shortly before she vanished, saying that Millard's girlfriend was threatening her and that she feared for her safety. Another friend testified that Laura had told her she was going to stay with a guy who had a place outside the city. She never said who. Christina Nudga, though not charged in Laura's case, became a central figure in the trial. Police had seized her laptop, which contained drafts of letters addressed to Millard in prison. In one, she wrote, "They don't have a body. They have nothing." Another file on the computer was a PowerPoint presentation titled "How to Frame a Narrative," which appeared to outline strategies for discrediting witnesses and managing public perception. Nudga was later charged with being an accessory after the fact in the Bosma case for allegedly helping Millard avoid detection and destroy evidence. But in Laura's case, the Crown did not allege her direct involvement. Still, her presence in the background of the timeline, her voice in the messages, her name in Laura's final communications cast a long shadow. The trial for Laura Babcock's murder began in late 2017. By then, Millard and Smitch had already been found guilty in the Bosma case and sentenced to life in prison without parole eligibility for 25 years. But the Babcock trial revealed a different, more intimate kind of violence. It painted a picture of a woman caught in a web of jealousy, manipulation, and cruelty, a woman whose life ended not for money or revenge, but for convenience. In court, Laura's parents sat silently as the evidence was read aloud. Her mother, Linda, later said that the hardest part wasn't the lack of a body, it was hearing how little their daughter's life had meant to the people who took it. "She was a person," she said. "She mattered." When the verdict came down in December of 2017, both Millard and Smitch were found guilty of first-degree murder once again. The judge addressed the courtroom, saying the evidence showed a deliberate plan to kill carried out with chilling efficiency. But even with 2 murder convictions behind them, the full story of Dylan Millard's crimes was not over. Another death, once ruled a suicide, had now come under forensic review. The man whose fortune Millard had inherited, whose company he had dismantled, and whose death had been quietly accepted without question. Wayne Millard, his father. In the quiet hours of November 29, 2012, a 911 call was placed from a house on Maplegate Court in Toronto. The caller was Dylan Millard. He told the dispatcher that he had just found his father, Wayne Millard, dead in bed from what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The responding officers arrived to find Wayne in his bedroom, a .32 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver resting on a pillow beside his head, a single gunshot wound above the left eye. The room was calm, undisturbed. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle, no blood spatter anywhere else in the home. Dylan told police he had last seen his father 2 days earlier. The coroner ruled it a suicide. No autopsy was ordered. The gun was swabbed and fingerprinted, but no usable prints were found. The case was closed within weeks. But after the arrests and convictions in the murders of Tim Bosma and Laura Babcock, homicide detectives from the Toronto Police Service's Cold Case Unit began reviewing the circumstances of Wayne Millard's death. It had never sat comfortably with some within the department. Wayne had no known history of depression or mental illness. He had recently invested heavily in expanding Millardaire's aircraft maintenance division and had expressed enthusiasm about its future. His business partners told police he had been fully engaged in the work. His friends described him as reserved, but stable. His death, they said, had come out of nowhere. The review began with the gun. Investigators re-examined the revolver and its purchase history. It had been bought just before Wayne's death by Dylan Millard through a friend who held a valid firearms license. The friend later told police he had no idea the gun would be used in any crime and that Millard had asked him to buy it as a collector's item. The weapon was then transferred into Dylan's possession. It was never reported stolen. Police also reviewed the forensic trajectory of the bullet. A new analysis conducted by the Center of Forensic Sciences found the angle of entry was inconsistent with a typical self-inflicted wound. The bullet had entered slightly above the left eye and traveled downward and backward, a trajectory more indicative of a shot fired by another person standing over the victim. Further scrutiny was given to Dylan's timeline. He had told authorities that he was not at his father's home the night of November 28th. He claimed to have stayed at his Etobicoke residence. But phone tower data placed his device at the Maplegate Court home during that exact window, specifically between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. and again early the next morning when he made the 911 call. Investigators also discovered that Millard had drained nearly all of the funds from Millardaire's accounts in the months following his father's death. The company, which had recently begun building a large new hangar at the region of Waterloo International Airport, was abruptly shuttered. Equipment was sold off. Staff were let go. The money, police found, funded Millard's personal lifestyle, cars, women, and the acquisition of the Eliminator incinerator used in later crimes. By 2017, the evidence was enough to lay charges. Dylan Millard was charged with first-degree murder in the death of his father. The Crown's case was clear. This had not been a suicide but a staged killing. They alleged that Millard had murdered his father to gain unfettered control of the family's assets and to remove the influence of a man who had tried, for years, to rein in his son's erratic behavior and spending. The trial began in June 2018 and was heard by a judge alone. The courtroom was quiet, methodical, and emotionally heavy. Forensic pathologists testified to the implausibility of the suicide theory. A former girlfriend of Millard's testified that he had once told her his father had been a failure and that he wouldn't be around much longer. Another friend recalled Millard saying he wished he could run Millardaire without the old man. The Crown introduced records of Millard's internet searches in the weeks leading up to Wayne's death. They included queries about bullet trajectories to the head, how to stage a suicide, and where to shoot someone to ensure death. There was also a search for the term how to inherit when a parent dies. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial. They maintained that Wayne Millard had taken his own life, possibly due to stress or personal demons that were not publicly known. They pointed to the absence of eyewitnesses, the lack of direct forensic evidence linking Dellon to the scene at the time of death, and the original suicide ruling by the coroner. But the judge found the Crown's case compelling. In September 2018, Dellon Millard was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of his father. The decision made him the first person in Canadian history convicted of 3 separate first-degree murders with 3 different victims in 3 unrelated incidents. The court concluded that Dellon Millard had killed for control, for power, and in at least one case, for amusement. Each murder had served a purpose: to eliminate an inconvenience, to assert dominance, or to clear a financial path. None had been impulsive. All had been meticulously planned. Mark Smitch, meanwhile, was not implicated in Wayne Millard's death. His involvement had been limited to the murders of Tim Bosma and Laura Babcock. He was convicted alongside Millard in both cases and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. Christina Nudga, though charged only as an accessory after the fact in the Bosma case, became a public figure of controversy. Her letters to Millard, her refusal to testify in earlier hearings, and her apparent willingness to protect him even after the nature of his crimes became clear drew widespread criticism. In 2017, she pleaded guilty and received a conditional sentence of 2 years less a day to be served in the community under strict conditions. She has since disappeared from public view. The families of the victims Charlene Bosma, the Babcocks, and those who had worked closely with Wayne Millard have continued their lives without closure in the traditional sense. There is no undoing what was done. No explanation that could ever make sense of why 3 lives were extinguished by someone who already had everything. In 2022, the Supreme Court of Canada struck down consecutive parole ineligibility periods for multiple murderers, citing the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The ruling meant that even serial killers like Dellon Millard would be eligible for parole after 25 years. For the Bosma and Babcock families, the decision was a fresh wound. Charlene Bosma spoke publicly after the ruling, saying, "He took the love of my life. He took a father from our daughter. There should be consequences that match what he did." Dellon Millard remains incarcerated at a maximum security facility. He continues to deny responsibility in all 3 murders. While he has exhausted most of his appeals, he has not expressed remorse, nor has he revealed the full truth about what happened in those final moments for each of his victims. The legacy of this case is not just one of horror, but of systemic reflection. Questions were raised about how easily Wayne Millard's death was ruled a suicide, how Laura Babcock's disappearance was dismissed, and how a wealthy man with no prior convictions could orchestrate multiple murders before anyone truly saw the pattern. In the end, it wasn't one murder that exposed Dellon Millard. It was the convergence of 3, each unique in motive, but all tied together by the same cold mind. A man who believed he could control every outcome, erase every obstacle, and rewrite every story. But some stories, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury them, refuse to stay quiet. Story 2. The Yukon Highway of Tears case. In northern British Columbia, the stretch of Highway 16 between Prince George and Prince Rupert is long, remote, and surrounded by dense forests. It's quiet there, except for the occasional roar of a passing truck or the wind moving through the trees. For decades, this part of Canada has carried a dark nickname, the Highway of Tears. Dozens of Indigenous women and girls have vanished or been murdered along this highway since the late 1960s. While some cases have been solved, most remain open, the details thin, the families left waiting. On June 21, 1994, 15-year-old Ramona Wilson left her home in Smithers, a small town along the highway surrounded by thick pine forest and mountains. She told her mother she was going to a friend's graduation dance. Ramona never made it there. She was last seen alive near the Highway of Tears, believed to be hitchhiking, something many young Indigenous people did in the area due to lack of public transportation. At first, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police didn't treat it as an emergency. Ramona's family was told she had likely run away and would return in a few days. But days turned into weeks, then months. Her mother, Matilda, knew something was wrong. Ramona wasn't the kind of girl to vanish. She was quiet, responsible, and close to her family. She had dreams of becoming a lawyer. She loved school, and she always came home. The RCMP's early response was slow. Flyers were printed, tips were followed up on, but no major search was launched in those first crucial days. Indigenous families in British Columbia had seen this before. Many of them had lost daughters and sisters along this same highway, and the pattern had repeated. Disappearances met with delayed responses, assumptions of runaway behavior, and eventually silence. Almost a year later, on April 9, 1995, Ramona's body was found. It was discovered by a man walking his dog near the Smithers Airport, just off a path in a wooded area. Her remains were partially decomposed, lying in the brush. She was still wearing some of the clothes she had on the night she disappeared. The area had been searched before, but somehow her body had been missed. Or, as some feared, it hadn't been there until more recently. The police opened a homicide investigation, but there were no witnesses, no clear signs of how she died. Due to the state of her remains, determining the exact cause of death was difficult. RCMP officers interviewed people in the area again, revisited earlier tips. Still, the case went cold. No arrests were made. No suspects were named. Ramona's family held a funeral and tried to push forward. But the questions stayed, and Ramona wasn't alone. In October 2004, 22-year-old Tamara Chipman, a member of the Gikson First Nation, was last seen hitchhiking near Prince Rupert. She was trying to get to Terrace. Like Ramona, she disappeared without a trace. Her father, Henry Chipman, worked on fishing boats and knew the coast well. He believed someone had picked her up along the highway and something terrible had happened. He and other family members organized their own searches, combing the woods and riverbanks, but they found nothing. Tamara's case remains unsolved. The disappearances began to draw more national attention in the early 2000s. Families began organizing walks along the highway to raise awareness. Yellow signs were erected along Highway 16, showing a silhouette of a young woman and the words "Girls Don't Hitchhike" on the Highway of Tears. But for many in the indigenous communities, the signs felt like a warning placed too late. One of the most publicized cases was that of Nicole Hoare, a 25-year-old tree planter who went missing in June 2002. Nicole wasn't indigenous, she was white, from Alberta, and her disappearance was met with intense media coverage. The RCMP launched a high-profile search. Helicopters, ground teams, and canine units were deployed. Billboards went up, but Nicole was never found. Some families couldn't help but notice the difference in response. In 2005, the RCMP launched Project EPANA, an initiative to investigate the cases of missing and murdered women along Highway 16 and surrounding areas. The project initially looked at 9 cases, all involving women who had disappeared while hitchhiking or whose bodies were found near highways. That number later grew to 18. All the cases involved women who had last been seen near Highways 16, 97, or 5, all part of British Columbia's Northern Road Network. To be included in Project EPANA, a case had to meet strict criteria. The victim had to be female, involved in high-risk behavior like hitchhiking or sex work, and have disappeared or been found within a certain distance of the highway. Critics argued that this excluded many women, especially indigenous women, who didn't meet every one of those conditions but had still vanished in similar circumstances. One of the few breakthroughs came in 2010. DNA evidence linked convicted serial killer Bobby Jack Fowler to the 1974 murder of Colleen Macmillan, a 16-year-old from Lacklaw Hatch, British Columbia. Fowler had died in prison in 2006, but his DNA was preserved in the FBI's database. The RCMP announced the match publicly and said they suspected he may have been involved in other cases along the highway. Fowler had a long history of violence. He had been convicted in the United States for kidnapping and attempted murder. He traveled across North America for work, often picking up transient jobs in construction. The RCMP couldn't place him in all the locations of the Highway of Tears disappearances, but they believed he might be responsible for at least 3. Still, most of the cases remained unsolved. Families continued to hold vigils and walk the length of the highway in memory of their daughters. They pushed for more public transportation in the area to reduce the need for hitchhiking. In 2017, British Columbia's provincial government finally announced funding for a bus service along Highway 16, connecting remote communities. But for many families, it was a hollow victory. The buses were a step forward, but they didn't bring back the daughters who were gone. Ramona Wilson's mother, Matilda, continued to speak publicly about her daughter's case. She attended gatherings, talked to the media, and kept Ramona's memory alive. She believed someone in the town knew what had happened, but had never come forward. As more women vanished and as more families added their daughters' faces to posters and memorials, the silence around the Highway of Tears began to feel like its own kind of violence. Whispers of systemic neglect, underfunded investigations, and racism echoed through the stories. Each case, like Ramona's, carried its own pain, its own unanswered questions, and its own community left in the dark. In the isolated terrain of the Yukon, the landscape is beautiful but unforgiving. The Alaska Highway, stretching from Dawson Creek through Whitehorse and up toward the Alaskan border, cuts through sweeping valleys, glacial rivers, and endless boreal forest. It is a place where the vastness of the land can swallow a person whole, and sometimes it does. While most of the public attention around the Highway of Tears has focused on northern British Columbia, the cases in the Yukon are no less haunting, and no less unresolved. One of them began on May 28, 1995. 20-year-old Angel Carlick was known for her resilience. She had survived a difficult childhood, spending time in foster care and group homes, but had recently found her footing. She was working at the Youth of Today's Society in Whitehorse, preparing for her high school graduation, and had been accepted to a college program. Angel had a spark to her, a quiet determination. She painted, she wrote poetry, and she cared deeply about helping other young people who had grown up like she did. She was last seen alive on the streets of downtown Whitehorse. She never made it to her graduation ceremony. Her disappearance was initially treated as concerning but not urgent. It was assumed she might have left town for personal reasons. But as days turned into weeks, and no one heard from her, not friends, not family, not co-workers, the fear deepened. Local volunteers posted flyers, organized searches, and walked through the wooded areas around the city. Still nothing. It wasn't until June 2007 that her remains were found, 2 years after she vanished. A hiker discovered a partially buried body in a forested area near Miles Canyon, just outside Whitehorse city limits. DNA confirmed it was Angel. The condition of her remains made it difficult to determine a cause of death, but foul play was suspected. The RCMP classified the case as a homicide. No arrests were made. The case remains unsolved. The discovery of Angel's body renewed focus on the dangers facing Indigenous women and girls in the Yukon. It was a reminder that these disappearances were not confined to British Columbia. They stretched north, deep into the Yukon River Basin, through communities like Watson Lake, Haines Junction, and Pelly Crossing, places where population is sparse, communication is difficult, and law enforcement is often hours away. In December 2004, 21-year-old Wendy Carlick, Angel's adopted mother, began attending vigils for missing women across the territory. She became a fierce advocate for justice, not just for Angel, but for all the women who had vanished or been killed in the North. Wendy spoke publicly, gave interviews, and helped form support networks for grieving families. She became a respected voice in the community. But in April 2017, Wendy herself was found murdered. She and another woman, 53-year-old Sarah McIntosh, were discovered dead inside a home in Whitehorse. Both had been killed, and the RCMP launched a double homicide investigation. The community was shaken. 2 Indigenous women murdered in the same home, both known to local support services, both connected to advocacy work. Felt like a cruel echo of the past. The deaths of Wendy and Sarah were part of a rising trend in the Yukon. Between 1980 and 2012, Indigenous women accounted for 16% of all female homicides in Canada, despite making up only 4% of the female population. In some territories, including the Yukon, that percentage was even higher. The violence was not isolated. It was systemic. One case that struck particularly close to the heart of Whitehorse occurred in October 2009. 17-year-old Maisie Odjick and her friend Shannon Alexander, 18, disappeared from Maniwaki, Quebec. Though not from the Yukon, their case sparked national attention and was included in discussions around northern disappearances due to its similarities. They vanished without warning, their belongings left behind in Shannon's apartment. Initial police response was slow. Family members criticized the assumption that the girls had simply run away. Years later, no trace of them has ever been found. In response to mounting pressure, the RCMP expanded their missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls database in 2015 to include cases from all provinces and territories, including the Yukon. But many families argued that the database did not go far enough. It lacked details. It excluded cases that hadn't been classified as homicides. And it didn't include women whose deaths were dismissed as accidental. One of the most disturbing cases to emerge from the Yukon occurred in 2009, when 20-year-old Jessica Patrick from the Tahltan Nation was found dead near a gravel pit outside of Whitehorse. She had last been seen leaving the Cedar Lodge Motel. Her family reported her missing quickly, but there was little public attention. Her aunt, Angela DeMeet, began posting updates on social media, organizing search parties, and contacting journalists. It wasn't until 6 days later that her body was found. The RCMP confirmed foul play, but to date, no charges have been laid. Jessica's family later said they believed she had been murdered by someone she knew, and they suspected that her killer was still walking free in Whitehorse. The lack of answers drove them to demand an inquest. They wrote letters to elected officials and participated in national gatherings for families of missing and murdered Indigenous women. In 2016, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls began collecting testimony across Canada. Hearings were held in Whitehorse in May 2017. Dozens of families came forward to share their stories. Mothers, sisters, and daughters spoke of women who had disappeared from roadside bars, from isolated communities, from foster homes. They spoke of police indifference, of being told their loved ones weren't high priority, of having to organize their own searches. One of the most powerful testimonies came from Judy Gingle, a former commissioner of the Yukon and a member of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation. She described the pain of watching generation after generation of women vanish or be killed and the silence that followed. She called for systemic change, not just better investigations, but better access to housing, healthcare, and education for Indigenous families. The inquiry's interim report, released in late 2017, acknowledged that the justice system had failed Indigenous women and girls across the country. It cited the Yukon as one of the regions with some of the most glaring disparities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations in terms of victimization, response time, and legal outcomes. Despite the findings, progress has been slow. Many of the families who testified in Whitehorse have said they still have not received updates on their loved ones' cases. Community-led initiatives, such as the Yukon Aboriginal Women's Council, have stepped in to provide support, but resources are limited. The territory's vast geography makes coordinated efforts difficult. And for many families, the fear remains close to the surface that their daughters' names will be forgotten, added to a growing list with no end. In 2019, a mural was painted in downtown Whitehorse. It features the faces of several missing and murdered Indigenous women from the Yukon. The artist, Jackie Olson, said she wanted to create something that couldn't be ignored. Something that forced people to look, to remember, and to ask questions. The mural was met with quiet reflection. Some passers-by stopped and stared. Others walked by in silence. But the names remain. Angel, Jessica, Wendy. So many others. Each one, a story incomplete. Each one, a life interrupted. And still, the highway runs quiet. A ribbon of asphalt through the wilderness. Beautiful. Endless. And, for too many, final. In August of 2021, a small group of women gathered quietly outside the Kwan Lin Dun Cultural Center in Whitehorse. They held photographs of missing daughters, sisters, and friends. Some of the women wore red dresses, a symbol that had come to represent the lives of Indigenous women and girls lost to violence across Canada. The gathering was not organized by government or police. It was led by families. For them, it wasn't about awareness anymore. It was about survival. Among those present was the family of 14-year-old Florence Charlie, who vanished from Whitehorse in March of 1968. It was one of the earliest recorded disappearances of an Indigenous girl in the territory and one of the least understood. Florence had been living in a residential school operated by the Anglican Church. She was reportedly last seen walking near the Yukon River before she vanished. Her body was found several days later, partially submerged in the icy water. The RCMP concluded she had drowned, but no inquest was ever held. Her family believed there was more to the story. In 2019, Florence's younger cousin submitted her name to the National Inquiry, hoping it would finally bring answers. During the Whitehorse hearings in 2017, several survivors of residential schools testified that disappearances like Florence's were not uncommon. One woman described a classmate who had vanished after telling staff she wanted to go home. The girl's belongings remained in the dormitory for weeks, but no one ever mentioned her again. There was no investigation. No call to her family. The pattern, they said, was silence. In 1985, another case shook the community of Watson Lake, a small town near the border with British Columbia. 27-year-old Shirley Adamson, a citizen of the Teslin Tlingit Council, was found dead along a gravel road just outside of town. She had been missing for several days. Her body was discovered by a passing motorist, and the RCMP quickly determined her death was the result of foul play. Despite interviews with dozens of witnesses and several persons of interest, no charges were ever laid. Shirley's case remains open in the Yukon RCMP historical case files. The frustration over such outcomes came to a head in 2018 when the Yukon Status of Women Council published a report titled Our Right to Safety. It detailed the failures Indigenous women in the territory faced when reporting violence. The report included testimonies from women who said they were discouraged from filing complaints or were not believed when they did. One woman recounted being turned away from a detachment after reporting a sexual assault. She was told she had been drinking and wasn't a credible witness. Her case was never pursued. In the same year, a review by the Yukon Department of Justice found that Indigenous women were significantly overrepresented in the corrections system. Though they made up less than 20% of the population, they accounted for nearly 80% of all incarcerated women in the Whitehorse Correctional Center. Advocates argued that this reality was deeply connected to the violence they faced. Many of the women in custody had been victims long before they entered the justice system. In 2019, the remains of a woman were found near Lake LaBerge, roughly an hour north of Whitehorse. The RCMP announced the discovery but did not immediately release the woman's identity. Weeks later, it was confirmed to be 43-year-old Pamela Napier, a member of the Koskadina Nation. She had been reported missing earlier that summer. Her death was classified as suspicious. No arrests were made. Her family described her as gentle and creative, someone who wrote letters to her children even when she had nothing else to give. Pamela's name was added to a growing list kept by the Yukon Aboriginal Women's Council. The council had been compiling cases that met no official criteria, cases that were never labeled as homicides or even missing persons, but which families insisted were unresolved. The list included women who had died in suspicious fires, women who were last seen leaving bars or shelters, and women whose deaths were ruled accidental despite evidence to the contrary. One such case was that of 32-year-old Mary Johns, who died in 2001 after being found unconscious on a trail behind a Whitehorse housing complex. The coroner ruled her death a result of hypothermia. but her sister testified during the inquiry that Mary had visible bruises on her face and arms. Witnesses claimed she had been seen arguing with a man shortly before she was found. The man was never located. Mary's case was never reopened. In 2020, the RCMP in the Yukon announced Project Northern Watch, a renewed effort to review unsolved cases involving Indigenous women in the territory. The project was modeled in part after Project EPANA in British Columbia but faced criticism for its limited scope. Only cases that had already been classified as murder or suspicious death were included. Families whose loved ones had vanished under unclear circumstances were told their cases did not qualify for re-examination. That same year, the Yukon government released the MIG-2S+ strategy, a 5-year action plan developed in partnership with Indigenous organizations. It outlined commitments to improving transportation, mental health services, and victim support. It also promised to increase funding for Indigenous-led investigations and ensure survivors were treated with dignity by the justice system. The plan was considered a major step forward, but many families remained skeptical. They had heard promises before. In 2021, a cold case unit was quietly formed within the RCMP's M Division in Whitehorse. Officers began reviewing historical files, some of which had not been touched in decades. One of the first cases reopened was that of 24-year-old Anna Marie Taylor, who disappeared in 1986 after leaving a birthday party in Carmacks. Her body was later found in a shallow creek miles from where she was last seen. The original investigation yielded no suspects. New forensic techniques were applied to the evidence, but no new leads were announced. The cold case unit also looked into the 1992 death of 26-year-old Dina Johnson. She had been found in a wooded area near Faro, her body partially concealed beneath a pile of branches. The RCMP initially treated her death as accidental, citing exposure as the likely cause. But her family insisted Dina had been afraid in the days before she died. She had told her cousin she was being followed. Her case had never been classified as a homicide. The cold case team promised to re-interview witnesses. Despite these efforts, arrests remained rare. Convictions rarer still. In 2022, the Yukon RCMP launched a public database of missing persons and unsolved homicides. It included over 30 names, more than half of them Indigenous. Each entry contained only basic information: the victim's name, age, date last seen, and a brief description of the case. No photos, no family statements. For some families, the listings were a painful reminder of how little had changed. Others saw it as a necessary foundation, a place to begin again. That same year, the Yukon's first Red Dress Day march took place in Dawson City. Over 200 people attended. They walked through the historic Gold Rush town silently, holding candles and signs, retracing the same steps many Indigenous women had taken in life on foot, often alone, through isolated stretches of land. At the end of the march, names were read aloud, one by one. Some names had been forgotten by the public. Others had never been known outside the families who carried them. In the final report of the National Inquiry, the commissioners stated that the violence faced by Indigenous women and girls constitutes a genocide. It was a powerful word, one that many in government had avoided. But for the families of the Yukon, it felt accurate. The slow erasure, the lack of justice, the silence. Each woman lost was not only a daughter or a sister, but a thread in the fabric of a people. And each loss left a hole. Today, the Alaska Highway still cuts through the north. It winds past quiet rivers and old mining towns, past signs warning of wildlife and sudden storms. It's a road of beauty, but also of memory. Every mile carries the weight of stories never finished. Some of those stories lie in the trees. Others fade into the permafrost. But they are there. And those who remember, they keep walking. Story 3. The Sandy Hook Elementary School Shooting. On the morning of December 14, 2012, at approximately 9:35 a.m., a 911 call came into the Newtown Police Department. The caller's voice was panicked. Gunshots were echoing over the phone line. The dispatcher tried to get details, but the only thing clear was the location, Sandy Hook Elementary School. The first officers arrived within minutes. Police from Newtown and surrounding jurisdictions converged on the small school building nestled in the quiet community of Sandy Hook, Connecticut. As they approached, they could hear gunfire coming from inside. Inside the school, the shooter, 20-year-old Adam Lanza, had already begun his attack. Earlier that morning, before driving to the school, he had shot and killed his mother, Nancy Lanza, in her bed at their home on Yogananda Street using a .22 caliber Savage Mark II rifle. She was shot 4 times in the head at close range. Her death was the first of 28 that would result from that day's violence. At the school, Lanza entered the building by shooting through a plate glass window next to the locked front entrance. He was armed with a Bushmaster XM15E2S rifle, a Glock 20 SF handgun, and a Sig Sauer P226, along with several 30-round magazines. He wore black clothing and carried multiple firearms in a vest. Principal Dawn Hawksprung and school psychologist Mary Sherlack had been in a meeting when they heard the noise. They stepped into the hallway to investigate. Lanza shot them almost immediately. Natalie Hammond, a lead teacher who was with them, survived despite being shot in the leg and foot. Other staff members began locking down classrooms and ushering students into hiding places. Lanza moved methodically toward 2 first-grade classrooms, rooms 8 and 10. In room 8, substitute teacher Lauren Rousseau had barely any time to react. She and behavioral therapist Rachel Davino tried to shield the students. Lanza entered and fired, killing Rousseau, Davino, and most of the children inside. In total, he killed 15 students in that room. Next, Lanza moved to room 10. Teacher Victoria Soto had attempted to hide her students in closets and storage spaces. When Lanza entered, she told him the children were in the gym. He shot and killed her along with 6 of her students. Others managed to survive by remaining hidden or running when Lanza was distracted. Within approximately 5 minutes of the first shots, 20 children and 6 adults were dead inside the school. 17 of the 20 children were 6 years old. The remaining 3 were 7. Each of the 6 adults had tried some by shielding, some by confronting to protect the children around them. Police entered the building cautiously, concerned about possible explosives or additional shooters, although Lanza acted alone. By 9:40 a.m., the gunfire had stopped. Officers found Lanza in one of the classrooms, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He had fired 154 rounds and had hundreds more rounds of ammunition on him. Outside, chaos unfolded. Parents had started to arrive after receiving panicked messages or phone calls. Law enforcement began the process of identifying who had survived and who had not. The firehouse next to the school became an impromptu staging area. Children who had been escorted out were brought there to reconnect with family. But for 20 families, that reunion would never happen. Connecticut State Police, the FBI, and local authorities began the process of securing the scene, collecting evidence, and identifying victims. The medical examiner, Dr. H. Wayne Carver II, later confirmed that all 20 children had been shot multiple times, most of them at close range. The use of the semi-automatic rifle had resulted in devastating injuries. Investigators soon turned their attention to the shooter's background. Adam Lanza had no criminal record, but his history was complex. He had been a student at Sandy Hook Elementary years earlier. He had been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, and records indicated long-standing difficulties with social interaction and anxiety. His mother had withdrawn him from school and later from high school entirely, opting to homeschool him. Authorities searched the Lanza household and found extensive material, newspaper clippings about mass shootings, violent video games, and detailed spreadsheets tracking past mass killings. Adam Lanza had compiled years' worth of data tracking the number of victims, weapons used, and other statistics. There was no manifesto, no clear explanation, only an obsessive interest in previous mass shootings. The guns used in the attack were legally owned by Nancy Lanza. She had been an avid gun owner and frequently took her son to shooting ranges. According to investigators, all of the weapons used by Adam were purchased by Nancy and kept in the home. The Bushmaster rifle, which was used in the school shooting, had been purchased legally in March 2010. Back at the school, The process of notifying families of the victims was described by law enforcement and medical personnel as one of the hardest aspects of the entire case. Parents were told to wait at the firehouse while officials attempted to identify the deceased. Those whose children did not appear were eventually informed, one by one, about the deaths. Across the country, news of the shooting spread rapidly. President Barack Obama was briefed within hours. That afternoon, he addressed the nation from the White House briefing room, visibly emotional. His voice broke as he said, "Our hearts are broken today." He called for meaningful action to prevent more tragedies like this, regardless of the politics. In Newtown, immediate shock gave way to collective mourning. Vigils were held. Makeshift memorials grew outside the school and across town. Flowers, teddy bears, candles, and notes from strangers covered sidewalks and fences. The country grieved with them, but for the small town of Newtown, the pain was intimate and overwhelming. The school building itself was closed indefinitely. The surviving students were relocated to another facility. Officials would later decide to demolish the original Sandy Hook Elementary School and rebuild it entirely. In Washington, D.C. and across state capitals, the political conversation around gun laws reignited. But for the families in Newtown, the focus remained on the names and lives of those lost. Each victim had a story. Each was a child or an adult who had gone to school that morning with no idea what would unfold. The investigation into Lanza's motives continued. The Connecticut State Attorney's Office, along with the FBI and state police, began compiling a report. The evidence painted a portrait of a deeply disturbed individual, isolated and consumed by violent interests, but it offered no clear motive. There was no single trigger, no final note. Only a series of red flags that, in hindsight, hinted at what he might have been capable of. And for the town of Newtown, nothing would ever be the same. In the days that followed the attack on Sandy Hook Elementary School, investigators from the Connecticut State Police Major Crime Squad remained inside the school building, working in silence. The interior had been left untouched. Chairs remained overturned. Backpacks were still lined up beside cubbies. What had once been a space of laughter and routine had transformed into a complex crime scene, requiring methodical documentation of every shell casing, footprint, and trace of movement. Forensic teams processed the scene over 5 full days. They cataloged 154 spent casings from the Bushmaster rifle and confirmed that the shooter had used the Glock pistol to end his own life. Surveillance equipment in the school's front office, though limited, captured audio of the initial gunfire. There were no interior security cameras. The lack of visual footage hampered efforts to trace the shooter's precise pathway through the corridors, but the physical evidence, ballistics trajectories, impact points, and bloodstains offered a grim reconstruction. Each victim's location was documented in extreme detail. The Connecticut office of the chief medical examiner later confirmed that the shooter had fired multiple rounds into nearly every victim. All of the children and staff who died in the attack had suffered fatal wounds from the rifle. The coroner's office determined that the ferocity and number of shots suggested a desire to inflict maximum damage in the shortest possible time, a conclusion supported by the rapid timeline of the assault. Authorities also examined the shooter's vehicle, a black 2010 Honda Civic parked just outside the school. Inside, they found a shotgun he had not used, along with additional ammunition, paper targets, and earplugs. There was also a smashed computer hard drive later recovered from the Lanza home, which forensic experts would attempt to analyze in the hopes of uncovering digital evidence of motive or planning. The hard drive had been physically damaged using a hammer or similar object, rendering much of the data unrecoverable. Back at the Lanza residence, the Connecticut State Police conducted a comprehensive search of every room. The home was quiet, cold. Draw blinds and blackout curtains covered the windows. Investigators found a gun safe and multiple firearms, all registered to Nancy Lanza. Among them were rifles, handguns, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Receipts confirmed that the weapons had been purchased legally over a period of several years. Nancy had completed background checks and had obtained the necessary permits under Connecticut law. Investigators also found books and printouts relating to mass murders, serial killers, and warfare. One document over 400 typed pages detailed a comparative analysis of mass shootings, with statistical breakdowns of casualty counts, timelines, and weapon types. The file had been compiled over months. It bore no title, no conclusion. Its tone was clinical and detached. In the basement, authorities discovered a small space where the shooter had spent most of his time. The walls were covered in black trash bags to reduce light. There was no bed, only a sleeping bag on the floor. A chair faced a desk with a disassembled computer. Empty energy drink cans were scattered throughout the room. Investigators noted that the shooter had isolated himself to a degree that bordered on total withdrawal. He had not held a job. He was not enrolled in school. He did not own a phone. He had no online presence under his own name. His only consistent contact had been with his mother. Medical records obtained through subpoena revealed a long history of developmental and psychological challenges. He had been diagnosed with sensory integration disorder as a toddler. By adolescence, he exhibited severe social anxiety, obsessive-compulsive behaviors, and pathological rigidity. At 13, he had been evaluated at the Yale Child Study Center, where clinicians documented his inability to interpret facial expressions, his aversion to touch and eye contact, and his obsessive interest in certain topics, including military history. According to the reports, clinicians had urged Nancy Lanza to pursue intensive behavioral therapy and medication. However, by the time the shooter was 16, he had rejected all treatment. He refused to take prescribed medications, citing side effects. He stopped attending school and rarely left the house. His mother, in interviews with family acquaintances later shared with investigators, had described herself as being overwhelmed, but believed she could manage his needs on her own. She did not report any violent behavior. There had been no police calls to the house, no signs of domestic disturbance. But according to journal entries recovered from the home, she had begun to express concern in the months leading up to the shooting. In one note, she wrote, "I'm not sure what he's thinking anymore. He's so far away from me now." In the course of the investigation, the Connecticut State Attorney's Office also examined the shooter's educational history. He had attended Sandy Hook Elementary for several years before transferring to other schools. His academic record was marked by inconsistencies, periods of high achievement followed by sudden withdrawal. Teachers had noted his discomfort around peers and his extreme sensitivity to noise. In middle school, he had been placed on an individualized education plan. But by high school, he was nearly fully withdrawn from in-person instruction. He completed his GED at age 16. There was no record of post-secondary education or job training. The shooter's relationship with his father, Peter Lanza, had been strained for years. Peter, a financial executive, had divorced Nancy in 2009. He had moved to Stamford, Connecticut, and remarried. According to later interviews conducted by law enforcement and the FBI, Peter had not seen his son in over 2 years at the time of the shooting. He had attempted to maintain contact through emails and letters, but those efforts had gone unanswered. In the wake of the tragedy, Peter Lanza cooperated fully with the investigation. He consented to interviews and provided access to family records. He described his son as a shell, someone who had retreated completely into himself. He expressed disbelief and sorrow, stating that he had seen no indication that his son was capable of such violence. As the investigation progressed, a clearer picture began to emerge, not of a conspiracy, but of a deeply isolated individual whose psychological deterioration had gone largely unaddressed. Authorities found no evidence of accomplices, no communication with extremist groups, and no online manifesto. The shooter had acted entirely alone. One of the most chilling discoveries came from a folder of short stories and essays written during his adolescence. In one, a character commits a school shooting and then takes his own life. The story ended with a passage describing the quiet that follows the gunfire. Investigators could not determine if this was fantasy or rehearsal, but it suggested that the idea had taken shape years earlier. By January, the crime scene had been released. The school was no longer active. Officials held a series of private meetings with victims' families, sharing the details of the investigation as they became available. The Connecticut State Police released a preliminary timeline of the shooting, confirming its duration less than 11 minutes from the first shot to the last. Each family was given access to the records pertaining to their child or loved one. Some chose to read them. Others did not. The final report, which would not be released until November of the following year, was still months away. But already, the scope of the tragedy was becoming clear. The victims had not been chosen individually. There had been no personal grievance. The attack was random, methodical, and devastating. And beneath it all was a question that investigators, psychologists, and parents would continue to ask: how could this have been prevented? There were no easy answers. Only an overwhelming silence that settled over the town of Newtown and over a nation still struggling to understand what had happened inside that elementary school. In the months following the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, the state of Connecticut launched multiple inquiries into the factors that led up to the attack, including a formal investigation by the Office of the Child Advocate. Their mission was not only to compile a complete developmental history of the shooter, but to identify systemic gaps, missed opportunities by educational institutions, healthcare providers, and family systems that might have changed the outcome. The findings, released publicly in late 2014, would add a deeper and more sobering dimension to the already wrenching story. The Office of the Child Advocate reviewed thousands of pages of documents, school records, emails, psychiatric evaluations, and law enforcement interviews. The report painted a portrait of a young man who had been struggling with profound developmental challenges since early childhood, and a family that had tried, often in isolation, to manage those challenges without fully engaging the public systems designed to help them. The shooter had exhibited symptoms of severe anxiety and sensory processing difficulties before the age of 3. Records showed that his preschool teachers reported significant social and emotional delays, including extreme sensitivity to touch and sound, limited eye contact, and rigid preferences. These concerns were echoed during his elementary school years, where staff noted that he was often overwhelmed by routine classroom activities and frequently withdrew from group settings. Initial interventions were made. He was placed on an individualized education program and received occupational and speech therapy services during his early education years. For a time, there was progress, but by middle school, his behavior had become more withdrawn. He began refusing to speak in class. He avoided physical contact entirely. Despite these difficulties, his academic abilities remained strong, particularly in math and science. A critical turning point occurred during his transition from middle to high school. Records from Newtown High School showed that he attended only briefly before being withdrawn by his mother. At that point, she shifted to an individualized homebound instruction plan with the cooperation of the school district. While technically legal under Connecticut law, this arrangement created a situation in which the student received minimal oversight from educational professionals. He completed high school requirements through a combination of tutoring and correspondence, but had little to no social interaction or psychological support during those years. The Office of the Child Advocate found that despite numerous evaluations by psychiatrists and psychologists, there was never a sustained effort to implement a comprehensive treatment plan. In one particularly telling instance, a Yale psychiatrist who evaluated the shooter at age 15 warned of a profoundly disabling condition and recommended intensive therapeutic services, including medication and regular mental health follow-up. However, there was no evidence that this plan was followed. He refused medication, and his mother did not pursue further psychiatric care. The report emphasized that while developmental disorders do not cause violence, the isolation, lack of treatment, and access to firearms created a dangerous convergence of factors. The shooter had become increasingly obsessed with violence, particularly mass shootings, during his teenage years. This obsession was not hidden. It was documented in school essays, computer files, and even casual conversations. but there was no intervention not from school officials, healthcare providers, or family members that addressed the growing fixation directly. In the absence of meaningful engagement with mental health systems, the shooter turned inward. The report noted that he communicated almost exclusively with his mother during the final years of his life. He did not work. He did not drive. He did not attend school. He spent most of his time alone in his room, consuming media and compiling data on mass shootings. Law enforcement agencies also continued to investigate the timeline of events leading up to the attack. Analysis of digital evidence from the recovered hard drive, while limited due to physical damage, revealed that in the weeks prior to the shooting, the perpetrator had conducted online research into past mass killings, school security protocols, and firearm specifications. He had created a document titled Megascript, which was a simulation-style narrative involving mass violence. The existence of this document indicated long-term planning, though it did not contain specific references to Sandy Hook Elementary or a definitive date. Investigators also uncovered communications he had made on internet forums under pseudonymous account names. Some of these messages explored violent ideation or referenced previous mass shootings in abstract or analytical terms. However, none of the messages revealed a direct threat or intention to carry out an attack. This further complicated the question of prevention. There were signs, but never a clear warning. In the aftermath of the shooting, many of the victims' families became active in public advocacy. Several parents formed organizations aimed at reducing gun violence through legislative reform and community education. Groups like Sandy Hook Promise and the Newtown Action Alliance emerged as prominent voices in the national conversation on gun control and mental health awareness. These organizations sought not only to honor the memory of those lost, but to prevent future tragedies by addressing the root causes of mass violence. One of the most significant legislative outcomes was the passage of Connecticut Public Act 13-3 in April of 2013. This extensive law expanded the state's assault weapons ban, introduced universal background checks for all firearm sales, and restricted the sale of high-capacity magazines. It also included provisions for improved school security and mental health services. The bill passed with bipartisan support and was signed into law by Governor Dannel Malloy. At the federal level, a similar effort to expand background checks was introduced in the United States Senate in the spring of 2013. Known as the Manchin-Toomey Amendment, the proposal garnered considerable attention but ultimately failed to pass. Despite widespread public support, it did not receive the 60 votes required to overcome a filibuster. The result left many of the Sandy Hook families devastated once again. The societal impact of the shooting extended far beyond legislative chambers. School districts across the country began reevaluating their safety protocols. Thousands of schools implemented new lockdown procedures, visitor check-in systems, and security upgrades. Nationwide, the debate intensified over the balance between safety and the psychological well-being of students. In Newtown, the grief remained deeply personal. In 2013, the decision was made to demolish the original Sandy Hook Elementary School building. The demolition process was carefully managed to prevent any visual media coverage out of respect for the victims' families. No public access was granted. Debris from the building was destroyed in such a way that no parts could be taken as souvenirs or relics. A new school was constructed on the same site and opened its doors in 2016. Designed with input from educators, parents, and security experts, the new facility emphasized both safety and healing. It featured natural light, open spaces, and secure access points, all intended to foster a sense of calm while maintaining security. No memorials or plaques were placed inside the school itself to avoid re-traumatizing students. Instead, remembrance was held in private and community spaces. The final report from the Connecticut State Attorney's Office, released in November of 2013, concluded that the shooter had acted alone and that no prior contact with law enforcement or mental health professionals had indicated a specific threat. The report did not recommend criminal charges against any individuals. as there was no legal liability found. However, it did emphasize the need for improved coordination between mental health services and educational systems. Public reaction to the final findings was subdued. By that point, the families had endured months of media scrutiny, political hearings, and emotional testimony. The loss was still fresh. Many chose to retreat from the spotlight. Others continued to speak publicly, but always in the hope that some future life might be spared. One of the most enduring legacies of the tragedy is the quiet resilience of the families who lost children that day. They did not ask to become activists. They did not seek attention. But in the face of unimaginable grief, they chose to act, not just in memory of their own loved ones, but for the safety of others. The Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting remains one of the deadliest acts of mass violence in American history. It was not the first, and it would not be the last. But it marked a turning point, a moment when the veil dropped and the nation was forced to confront the intersection of untreated mental illness, access to high-powered firearms, and systemic gaps in care. Years later, the names of those lost still echo through the halls of remembrance. They are not statistics. They are not symbols. They were children and educators, each with a story cut short. And for those left behind, for the parents who wake to empty bedrooms, for the siblings who learn too early what loss feels like, and for the community that still gathers in quiet vigils, the silence continues to speak louder than any answer ever could. Story 4. The Ebony Simpson Murder. It was the afternoon of August 29th, 1992, in Bargo, a quiet town on the southwestern edge of Sydney's metropolitan fringe. At around 3:30 in the afternoon, a school bus dropped off 12-year-old Ebony Simpson at the end of her long driveway on Bargo Road. Her mother, Christine Simpson, was supposed to pick her up, but on that particular day, Christine had been delayed. Ebony had never walked home alone before. Witnesses later recalled that they saw Ebony exit the bus and start walking in the direction of her house. She was wearing her school uniform, carrying her backpack, and had a book in her hand. But she never made it home. When Christine arrived at the usual drop-off point moments later and found her daughter missing, she immediately began to panic. Ebony wasn't the kind of child who wandered off or disobeyed. She was reliable, quiet, and cautious. Something felt wrong almost instantly. By 4 o'clock, Christine had alerted local police. Officers responded quickly, deploying a search that began with the immediate area around the Simpson home and expanded outward. Hundreds of volunteers joined the effort, combing through bushland, creeks, and backroads. Police helicopters circled overhead. But as daylight faded into evening, there was still no sign of Ebony. The following day, the search intensified. Authorities brought in search dogs, divers, and mounted units. The community of Bargo, small and close-knit, was deeply shaken. Parents kept their children indoors. People locked their doors in broad daylight. What had once felt like a safe rural town now seemed like something else entirely. Then, on August 31st, 2 days after Ebony disappeared, police divers searching a dam on a property in Wilton, a town not far from Bargo, made a grim discovery. Submerged underwater, wrapped in a school bag weighed down with rocks, was the body of Ebony Simpson. Her wrists and ankles had been bound with wire. An autopsy would later confirm that she had been raped and then drowned while still unconscious. The brutality of the crime stunned even the most seasoned officers. Detective Inspector Russell Oxford, who would later lead the investigation, described it as one of the most horrific crimes he had encountered in his career. The fact that the victim was a child only 12 years old hit everyone involved in the case with particular force. The investigation shifted immediately. The area where Ebony's body had been found was remote and difficult to access, suggesting that whoever was responsible had local knowledge. Police began canvassing neighborhoods, questioning known offenders in the region, and checking vehicle logs and witness statements from the day of her disappearance. It didn't take long for suspicion to form around a man named Andrew Peter Garforth. He was 29 years old, lived nearby, and had a long history of petty criminal behavior. Garforth had been seen in the area on the day Ebony disappeared. He also had access to a car that matched descriptions given by neighbors who reported seeing a suspicious vehicle near the bus stop around the time Ebony was last seen. Garforth was brought in for questioning on September 1st. During the interview, he initially denied any involvement. But later that evening, faced with mounting evidence, he confessed in chilling detail. According to official police transcripts, Garforth admitted that he had seen Ebony walking alone, pulled up alongside her, and lured her into his car. He said he drove her to a secluded area, sexually assaulted her, and then bound her hands and feet. He placed her in the car's boot and drove to the dam in Wilton, where he threw her into the water while she was still alive but unconscious. His confession was detailed and consistent with forensic findings. Police located the wire used to bind Ebony along with other physical evidence that corroborated his account. Garforth showed no signs of remorse during his confession. Officers who were present during the interview described his demeanor as cold and detached. The community's reaction was immediate and fierce. Vigils were held in Bargo and surrounding towns. People laid flowers at the Simpson family home. Strangers sent letters, cards, and messages of support. But there was also anger, deep and visceral. Many demanded the reinstatement of the death penalty, which had been abolished in New South Wales decades earlier. The Simpson family was shattered. Christine and her husband, Peter, withdrew from the public eye. Their grief was all-consuming. Garforth was charged with the abduction, rape, and murder of Ebony Simpson. Given the strength of the evidence and his full confession, legal proceedings moved quickly. His trial would begin in the months that followed, but even before then, the weight of public outrage had made him one of the most hated figures in Australia. In the days following his arrest, politicians and media outlets debated whether existing sentencing laws were sufficient. There was a renewed call for tougher penalties for crimes involving children. The case had struck a nerve at a national level, not just because of its brutality, but because it had happened in a place where people felt safe. Ebony Simpson was the youngest of 3 children. Her family described her as thoughtful, creative, and deeply loved by her siblings. She had a quiet presence, preferred reading to television, and loved animals. On the morning she disappeared, she had left the house like it was any other school day, without fear, without hesitation. None of them could have imagined how quickly that would change. Authorities later revealed that Garforth had no prior convictions for violent sexual offenses, which made his sudden escalation to such a brutal crime all the more terrifying. He was not on any police watch list. In many ways, he had slipped under the radar, a man with a history of minor theft and burglary, but no indication of what he was capable of. In the aftermath of Ebony's murder, the Simpson family began advocating for victims' rights. They called for changes to sentencing laws and more support for families affected by violent crime. Their grief became a platform for change, though the pain behind it never left. Ebony's death would go on to be a catalyst for legislative reform in New South Wales. Over the following weeks, police continued to gather evidence, build their case, and prepare for trial. But in the eyes of the public and in the hearts of those who had followed every sickening detail, there was little left to prove. Ebony had been taken in broad daylight in a town where the worst thing most people worried about was a flat tire or a lost dog. Her murder shattered the illusion of safety and changed everything that followed. On September 3, 1992, 2 days after Andrew Peter Garforth's taped confession to the abduction, assault, and murder of 12-year-old Ebony Simpson, detectives escorted him under heavy guard to the Supreme Court in Sydney. The public had already learned the details of his statement. It was front-page news in nearly every major Australian newspaper. Members of the press surrounded the entrance to the courthouse. Behind them stood dozens of bystanders, many of whom had made the hour-long journey from Bargo. Some held signs, some simply stared in silence. The expression on their faces was not outrage, it was something deeper, something harder to articulate. Inside the courtroom, Garforth showed little reaction as the charges were formally read. He was represented by a legal aid solicitor. The presiding judge denied bail immediately. The courtroom remained tense throughout the brief appearance. Outside, Christine and Peter Simpson did not attend. They were at home, quietly preparing for their daughter's funeral. The funeral was held on September 6th at the Mittagong Anglican Church. The small sandstone building was filled beyond capacity. Friends, classmates, teachers, and neighbors filled the pews. Some stood outside under overcast skies, listening through open doors. Reverend Tony Ireland conducted the service. He spoke softly, addressing the congregation as if speaking directly to Ebony herself. Her school friends placed flowers on the casket one by one. Each arrangement had a handwritten note tucked between the stems. The service was private after that. The Simpson family had asked for no media presence at the burial. Local police helped enforce the request. In the days that followed, a memorial plaque was installed near the school bus stop where Ebony was last seen. It was simple: her name, her age, and the words, "Forever loved." Back in Sydney, the legal process moved quickly. Garforth had given a full confession with no legal counsel present. The New South Wales police force ensured that every part of the statement had been properly documented and witnessed. Investigators compiled forensic evidence to support the case, including fibers from Garforth's car that matched Ebony's school uniform and marks on her body that matched the wire later recovered near the dam. There was no indication of any accomplice. Surveillance records, phone logs, and witness statements all pointed to an isolated act. The Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions determined that the case would proceed directly to sentencing. Garforth entered a formal plea of guilty to all charges on November 3, 1992. The courtroom was silent as the plea was recorded. No trial would take place. The evidence had been overwhelming, the confession uncontested. But the sentencing hearing itself would become one of the most closely watched legal moments in Australian criminal history. On January 19, 1993, Justice Peter Newman delivered the sentence. Over the course of nearly 2 hours, he recounted the facts of the case in full detail. He described the premeditated nature of the crime, the vulnerability of the victim, and the complete lack of remorse shown by Garforth. The courtroom remained silent throughout. When Justice Newman reached the conclusion of his remarks, his voice did not rise. He simply stated, "In my view, this is one of those rare cases in which a sentence of life imprisonment should be imposed and one in which no minimum term should be fixed." Garforth was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. At the time, such a sentence was legally rare. Under the Sentencing Act of 1989, life sentences without parole were permitted but not commonly imposed. In most cases, even life terms came with a non-parole period. Garforth's sentence was one of only a handful in New South Wales history to exclude that entirely. Justice Newman's ruling made clear that the decision was based on the exceptional cruelty of the crime and the danger Garforth posed to the public. Following the sentencing, Ebony's parents released a brief written statement through the New South Wales Victims of Crime Bureau. They thanked the police, the community, and the legal team. They did not comment on the sentence itself. In the months that followed, Christine and Peter Simpson began working with victim advocacy groups to push for legislative reform. They were quiet in their approach, measured, formal, but determined. In late 1993, Christine Simpson became involved with the newly formed Homicide Victims Support Group, which had been established by parents affected by similar losses. Alongside other families, she began attending meetings with state lawmakers to advocate for changes to sentencing transparency, parole notifications, and victim representation. Her voice, calm but resolute, began to shape new conversations around the rights of victims' families in the justice process. Meanwhile, Garforth was transferred to the Goulburn Correctional Centre, a high-security facility located in the southern tablelands of New South Wales. He was placed in protective custody upon arrival. Other inmates had already learned of his crime. Prison authorities later confirmed that he had been involved in multiple altercations during his first months in custody. He remained under 23-hour lockdown for most of his incarceration. In 1997, the New South Wales Department of Corrective Services released internal reports confirming that Garforth had shown no signs of rehabilitation. Psychological assessments conducted over a 3-year period indicated a lack of empathy and a high risk of recidivism. These findings would be cited in later discussions about the permanency of life sentences and the criteria for parole eligibility. In 2001, a new development brought the Simpson family back into the public eye. The New South Wales Sentencing Council began reviewing historical life sentences in an effort to align them with legislative changes introduced under the Crimes Sentencing Procedure Act 1999. As part of that process, offenders serving life without parole were technically required to be reviewed for potential redetermination. The proposal sparked immediate backlash. Christine Simpson, supported by members of the Homicide Victims Support Group, addressed the media directly, stating that any reconsideration of Garforth's sentence would be a betrayal of every promise made to families like ours. Her remarks triggered a wave of public support. Petitions were circulated. Letters flooded the offices of state legislators. Eventually, the Attorney General of New South Wales intervened. He issued a directive excluding Garforth's case from the review process, citing the original sentencing judge's explicit statement that no minimum term should ever apply. The directive was upheld by the Supreme Court. Garforth's sentence remained unchanged. By the early 2000s, Ebony's case had become a touchstone in broader discussions about child protection laws in Australia. It was cited in parliamentary debates over the introduction of the Child Protection Offenders Registration Act 2000, which created a register of known child sex offenders in New South Wales. While Garforth himself was already serving a life term, his case was used as a symbol of why such legislation was necessary. In 2003, Christine Simpson was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia for her advocacy in victims' rights and criminal justice reform. She accepted the honor quietly without a press conference. Her work continued in classrooms, community centers, and legislative offices, always focused, always deliberate. Ebony's story never faded from public memory. Each August, local newspapers in Bargo published brief memorials. Her former school established an annual award in her name, given to a student who demonstrated kindness and empathy. The memorial plaque near the bus stop remained untouched for decades. The grass around it was trimmed every week by a neighbor. No one ever asked him to do it. Andrew Peter Garforth remains incarcerated at the Goulburn Correctional Center. He has never filed an appeal. He has never issued a public statement. According to official records released under Freedom of Information laws, he has received no visitors in over 20 years. Christine and Peter Simpson have never spoken his name publicly. When asked in interviews, they refer only to the man who took her. Their focus remains on Ebony, not on what was done to her, but on who she was, a child, a daughter, and a life that should never have ended. In the years that followed the sentencing of Andrew Peter Garforth, the murder of Ebony Simpson remained one of the most deeply felt crimes in Australian history. But beyond the courtroom, a quieter transformation had begun to take shape, one that would alter how the criminal justice system in New South Wales responded to violent crimes and how the voices of victims' families were heard. In 1994, Ebony's parents Christine and Peter Simpson joined forces with other families affected by homicide to strengthen the Homicide Victims Support Group, HVSG, which had been established a year earlier. The group was formed after the murder of Anita Cobby, and it quickly became a vital resource for families navigating the aftermath of violent loss. Christine Simpson, in particular, took on a central role, advocating not only for changes in sentencing law but for the emotional and psychological needs of those left behind. The group lobbied for reforms that included mandatory victim impact statements, greater transparency in parole proceedings, and increased funding for counseling services. Their message was consistent. Justice should not end with a sentence. It should include recognition of ongoing trauma, and the public should be protected not just by punishment but by policy. This advocacy bore real results. In 1996, amendments were made to the Crimes Sentencing Procedure Act, allowing more weight to be given to victim impact statements in cases involving serious crimes. For the first time, families were permitted to speak directly in court about the consequences of the crime, not just on the lives of the deceased, but on the lives of those who had to keep living. During this period, The Simpson family largely avoided public interviews, but they worked steadily behind the scenes. Christine served on advisory panels, consulted on legislative drafts, and helped organize support for other families enduring similar tragedies. She never referred to her involvement as activism. In her own words, she simply called it keeping the promise, a way to ensure that Ebony's life, however short, would not be forgotten or reduced to a single act of violence. Meanwhile, Garforth remained in solitary confinement at Goulburn Correctional Center. According to internal Department of Corrective Services reports filed between 1994 and 2000, he had been evaluated multiple times by prison psychologists. Each report continued to classify him as high risk with an absence of remorse, and each assessment confirmed that he had refused all rehabilitation programs offered to him. In 1997, following a review into the classification of life sentences in New South Wales under the Crimes Sentencing Procedure Amendment Act, authorities considered whether inmates serving life without parole should be eligible for redetermination under certain conditions. Though the review was procedural, the idea that Garforth's sentence could even be assessed reignited public anger. Correspondence released years later under the Government Information, Public Access Act showed that the Attorney General's office received over 20,000 letters and petitions in the span of a few months, all opposing any reconsideration of the sentence. Among them was a letter co-written by Christine and Peter Simpson, addressed to the Premier and signed by over 100 families of homicide victims. The letter stated that the sentence handed down was not simply a legal formality, but a commitment made to the public and to them. In response, the then Attorney General Jeff Shaw issued a formal statement in 1998 confirming that no redetermination would be applied in Garforth's case. He referenced the sentencing judge's original remarks, which had declared that no minimum term should ever be set. This decision was later upheld by the Supreme Court, making Garforth one of the few individuals in New South Wales to be excluded entirely from parole consideration under the revised framework. While legal developments continued to unfold, the Simpson family established a scholarship in Ebony's name at her former primary school. The award was given each year to a student who demonstrated compassion, responsibility, and courage, qualities that Ebony's teachers had noted in her school reports. The scholarship was not widely publicized. It was a private gesture meant to anchor her memory in something living. In 2001, the Homicide Victims Support Group opened Grace's Place, a counseling and retreat center for children and families affected by homicide. Though Christine Simpson had stepped back from public advocacy by then, her early groundwork helped secure funding and community support for the project. The facility offered trauma counseling, grief support, and temporary housing, a space where healing could begin, however slowly. The same year, a revised version of the Crimes Administration of Sentences Act was introduced. It included provisions that required the families of victims to be notified in advance of any significant changes to an inmate's classification, transfer, or health status. These reforms were a direct result of lobbying efforts led by victims groups, including the HVSG, and were designed to ensure that families were not left behind or blindsided by procedural developments. In media coverage during this time, Ebony's name was often cited alongside other high-profile cases, but her family declined interview requests. They had made a decision early on not to speak publicly about the details of her murder. Instead, they wanted the emphasis to remain on her life, on who she was before August 29, 1992. In 2005, a documentary aired on Australian television chronicling the impact of child homicide on families. Though the Simpsons did not appear, the segment dedicated to Ebony included interviews with her former teachers, schoolmates, and neighbors. One classmate, now in her 20s, described Ebony as a gentle person who always made space for others. That memory, shared so many years later, stood in contrast to the cold facts of the case, and yet it offered something more enduring. By 2010, the New South Wales government had implemented a series of reforms that directly reflected recommendations made by HVSG and other victim advocacy groups. These included the establishment of a dedicated Victims Services Commissioner, the expansion of financial assistance for counseling and funeral costs, and the formal recognition of victim impact statements in the parole process. Each of these changes carried the fingerprints of those who had spoken from personal experience, often at great emotional cost. Garforth remained in the same facility under the same restrictions. In 2012, a review of high-risk offenders conducted by the Inspector of Custodial Services included Garforth by name. The report concluded that there was no evidence of behavioral change or participation in rehabilitation. He continued to have no access to communal areas and remained housed in a section of the prison designated for inmates at risk of retribution from others. In 2018, the 30-year anniversary of the Homicide Victims Support Group was marked by a formal gathering at Parliament House. Though Christine and Peter Simpson were not in attendance, their contributions were acknowledged in speeches delivered by both legislators and fellow advocates. A plaque bearing Ebony's name was added to the HVSG Memorial Wall in Sydney, a permanent tribute to her life and the work her family had done in her memory. As of today, Andrew Peter Garforth remains incarcerated at Goulburn Correctional Center. His sentence, life imprisonment with no possibility of parole, has not been altered, appealed, or amended. He has not spoken publicly, and there is no record of any application for reconsideration. His name does not appear on any parole board schedule, nor has it since the day of his sentencing. Ebony Simpson's story is not defined by the man who took her, but by the legacy that followed. Her family transformed their grief into advocacy. Her community built support systems for others in pain. And her memory became a catalyst for change that extended far beyond the borders of Bargo. Some names fade with time. Others remain, not because of how they died, but because of what they left behind. Ebony's legacy is one of quiet resilience and determined justice. It lives on in the laws that protect others, in the families who find shelter in the systems she helped reshape, and in the children who receive an award in her name each year, young lives whose futures she never had, but whose safety she continues to shape. And for those who remember that overcast afternoon in August 1992, there is a silence that still echoes, a pause at the end of a sentence, a name that is spoken softly, promise kept. Story 5, The Robert Pickton Murders. On February 6, 2002, police arrived at a pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, with a search warrant related to illegal firearms. The property was vast, over 17 acres of rural land, cluttered with trailers, vehicles, and debris. It belonged to a man named Robert William Pickton. At first glance, the farm didn't seem like the setting for one of the worst serial murder investigations in Canadian history. But within days, investigators would uncover a horrifying reality. The search that day was supposed to be routine. But as officers moved through the property, they saw enough to justify a second warrant, this time one that would allow them to search for evidence related to the disappearance of local women. That decision would widen the scope of the investigation far beyond what anyone had anticipated. By February 22nd, Pickton had been arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The victims were Serena Abotswe and Mona Wilson. Their names were already familiar to investigators working in Vancouver's downtown east side. Both women had been reported missing, like dozens of others over the years. They were part of a troubling pattern: women, mostly Indigenous, working in survival sex work, disappearing one by one from the streets. For years, families had raised alarms, but police departments had been slow to connect the dots. In the early 1990s, community members and advocates began to notice the pattern. By 1999, the Vancouver Police Department had compiled a list of women reported missing from the downtown east side. That list would eventually grow to over 60 names. The disappearances were treated as isolated incidents for far too long. Some officers believed the women had simply moved away or were lost in the system due to addiction. It wasn't until the numbers became impossible to ignore that a joint task force was created between the Vancouver Police and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in 2001. They called it Project Evenhanded. But even then, it took years for the investigation to make real progress. Families of the missing women had been organizing marches, holding vigils, and pleading with authorities for help. Many said their concerns were dismissed. The victims were often marginalized, and that played a role in the lack of urgency. Back on the farm in Port Coquitlam, the scale of what had happened there was becoming clearer. Investigators brought in forensic anthropologists and excavation crews. They would end up spending over 20 months on the property. The work was slow. They sifted through mountains of soil and debris, looking for bone fragments, teeth, and other remains. Inside freezers, they found plastic bags containing human remains. Some were marked with the names of victims. The evidence was graphic and overwhelming. Among the remains identified were those of Brenda Wolfe, Andrea Josbury, and Georgina Papine. All of them had been reported missing from the same area. The number of charges against Pickton would grow over time from 2 to 15, and eventually to 27. But the investigation suggested he may have killed even more. Robert Pickton was well known in his community. To some, he seemed like a reclusive farmer. He and his siblings had inherited the pig farm from their parents. Robert lived in a small trailer on the property. His brother David managed the farm's business affairs. The farm had been in the family since the 1950s, but over the years it had become a strange and run-down place. According to statements made in court, the Pickton brothers had held parties there, sometimes referred to as Piggy's Palace, where sex workers and partygoers would gather. The property was a mix of rural isolation and urban access. It was the perfect place for someone to operate in secrecy. In 2007, during his trial, prosecutors would argue that Pickton lured women to his farm using drugs and alcohol, then murdered them and disposed of their remains in ways that hindered identification. Some remains were believed to have been fed to pigs. Others were processed through a meat rendering machine. Forensic evidence included DNA from multiple victims found on items throughout the property. What's even more disturbing is that there had been earlier opportunities to stop him. In 1997, a woman had escaped from Pickton's farm. She had been stabbed and managed to flee, bleeding heavily, to a nearby road where she flagged down a passing car. She was rushed to the hospital and Pickton was arrested at the scene. However, charges were later stayed. The woman, a sex worker, struggled with addiction and prosecutors deemed her an unreliable witness. That decision would have deadly consequences. The trial would later reveal that Robert Pickton had told an undercover officer planted in his jail cell that he had killed 49 women and that he had wanted to make it an even 50. That statement was audio recorded and played for the jury. It became one of the key pieces of evidence used to show his intent and consciousness of guilt. As the list of identified victims grew, the public became increasingly horrified. Families of the missing women had waited years for answers. Many had long suspected a serial killer was operating in the area, but their concerns had been brushed aside. The trial brought some closure, but also exposed deep flaws in how law enforcement had handled the case from the beginning. By December of 2007, Pickton was convicted on 6 counts of second-degree murder. The judge chose to try those 6 cases first as they had the strongest forensic evidence. The other 20 charges were stayed with the option to pursue them later if needed. Pickton received a life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum sentence allowed under Canadian law at the time. The investigation into Robert Pickton's crimes stretched on for years, both before and after his conviction. The cost of the investigation and trial exceeded $70 million. But the true cost was something else entirely: the lives lost, the families shattered, and the trust broken. To this day, the full number of Pickton's victims is unknown. Human remains and DNA from at least 33 women were found on the property, but not all could be formally identified. Many families still live without definitive answers. And for many people in Vancouver's downtown east side, the case represents more than just one man's crimes. It's a symbol of systemic failure, of how society treats its most vulnerable, and what happens when pleas for help go unheard. In the spring of 2002, as the soil at the Pickton farm was being combed inch by inch, a cold, methodical process unfolded behind police lines. The scale of the forensic search was unlike anything Canadian authorities had faced before. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police brought in over 100 investigators, anthropologists, and forensic specialists. Every item on the property, every discarded boot, every rusted tool was treated as potential evidence. Excavation began in what had once been pig pens. The terrain was difficult, wet, rotting, and cluttered with decades of organic waste. But buried beneath it all, they began to find fragments. Human teeth, jawbones, pieces of skull. Some were scorched, others shattered. The remains were so degraded that traditional visual identification proved impossible. It was only through mitochondrial DNA analysis that some victims could eventually be named. That process, slow and meticulous, would take years. Inside one of the freezers, police discovered severed heads, hands, and feet stored in plastic buckets. Some were labeled. Others were not. One container held the partial remains of Mona Wilson. Another, a bag containing human flesh, had been mixed with pork. In a garage on the property, authorities located a meat grinder. It was industrial grade, capable of breaking down bone. Nearby, they found a power washer stained with what appeared to be dried blood. The DNA results confirmed that it belonged to multiple women. The remains of Andrea Joesbury were recovered in a bucket found behind the slaughterhouse. She had been missing since June of 2001. Her DNA matched samples collected from her family. Brenda Wolf's jawbone was located buried under rubble beside a rusted trailer. Her sister had submitted her dental records years earlier, hoping they'd never be needed. As more evidence emerged, the prosecution began mapping out the timeline of the disappearances. They determined that the earliest known murder linked to the site occurred in the early 1990s. However, the timeline was difficult to pin down. Many of the women had no fixed address. Some were not reported missing for months. Others were never officially reported at all. The pattern that had once been invisible to law enforcement was now undeniable. Among the items seized was a pair of handcuffs still attached to a length of rope. Next to them, a syringe filled with windshield washer fluid. That detail was especially chilling. In statements later released during court proceedings, the Crown alleged that Pickton injected his victims with the fluid before or after killing them. Toxicology reports from preserved remains confirmed the presence of methanol, a compound found in antifreeze and windshield solutions. Detectives also found women's clothing, shoes, and jewelry scattered throughout the trailers and outbuildings. Some items were matched to missing persons through family photos. Others remained unidentified. In one case, a woman's purse was found inside a filing cabinet. It still held her ID, expired bus tickets, and a small photograph of a child. The investigation expanded beyond the physical property. Police began tracing Pickton's movements through financial records, phone logs, and witness statements. They discovered that he frequently visited Vancouver's downtown east side. Several witnesses testified that he offered women food, money, or drugs to come back to his farm. Some said he promised them a warm place to stay. Others said he gave them cash simply to keep him company. One woman, whose identity was protected by a publication ban, testified that she had visited the farm multiple times in the late 1990s. She described it as filthy, filled with garbage and animal waste. On her final visit, she recalled seeing what she believed was human hair stuck to the blades of a saw. When she asked about it, Pickton told her it was just from a pig. She left and never returned. As investigators pursued every lead, they uncovered a disturbing piece of information. In 1996, the city of Port Coquitlam had issued a business license to the Pickton brothers for an organization called the Piggy Palace Good Times Society. Officially, it was a nonprofit intended to raise funds for local charities. In practice, it operated as a venue for wild parties, many of which were attended by bikers, drug dealers, and vulnerable women from the city. These events took place in a converted slaughterhouse on the property. Witnesses described open drug use, prostitution, and violence. The parties were large, sometimes drawing dozens of attendees. Police had received complaints from neighbors about the noise and the people coming and going, but little action was taken. The society was eventually stripped of its nonprofit status for failing to file proper paperwork. But by then, the damage had already been done. It had served, knowingly or not, as a mechanism for bringing more women to the farm and placing them directly in harm's way. Police also reviewed the case of Wendy Lynn Eisteter, the woman who had survived a brutal attack on the farm in 1997. Her testimony had been dismissed years earlier due to inconsistencies and concerns about her credibility. But in light of the new findings, her account was re-examined. She had told officers that Pickton had handcuffed her, stabbed her in the stomach, and attempted to kill her. She managed to grab a weapon and fight back. Both of them required hospitalization. Police had taken statements from them at the time, but after initial charges were dropped, the case was abandoned. Now, with forensic evidence tying Pickton to multiple victims, her story was seen in a new light. It had been a missed opportunity, one that could have prevented further deaths had it been pursued more aggressively. By the end of 2003, authorities had identified the remains or DNA of at least 20 victims. Each identification was a painstaking process involving forensic specialists, dental records, and family cooperation. In some cases, only a single bone or tooth could be recovered. In others, only a small trace of genetic material. Many families were contacted directly by police, some after more than a decade of silence. For them, the news arrived not as closure, but as confirmation of a long-feared truth. Behind closed doors, legal preparations were underway. Pickton was charged with 27 counts of first-degree murder. The Crown faced a dilemma: whether to try all of the cases at once or to divide them. Ultimately, they chose to move forward with 6, the ones with the strongest physical evidence. The rest would be held in reserve. That decision was not without controversy. Families of the victims whose cases were stayed felt angry and forgotten. Some had waited years for justice, only to be told their loved ones' cases would not be heard in court. Prosecutors insisted that this strategy would ensure a conviction and avoid overwhelming the jury. But for many, it felt like another failure in a long series of institutional betrayals. As Pickton awaited trial, he remained largely silent. He made no public statements. He declined interviews. But in a moment that stunned both investigators and prosecutors, he began speaking to an undercover officer planted in his cell. Over several days, Pickton bragged about his crimes. He spoke about his plans, his regrets, and the number of women he had killed: 49. He said he had wanted to make it 50. The confession was recorded using a hidden microphone. When it was played in court, the room fell silent. There was no remorse in his voice, only frustration that he hadn't reached his goal. In the years that followed, the investigation at the farm became the most expensive and complex in Canadian history. Search crews worked through nearly every building, every tool, every square meter of soil. The property was eventually rendered uninhabitable. Parts of it were excavated down to the bedrock. And still, not every victim could be identified. The case prompted a national reckoning. Questions were raised about how missing persons cases were handled, particularly those involving Indigenous women and sex workers. Public inquiries were launched. Reports were issued, but for many, the damage had already been done. And Robert Pickton? He remained in custody, awaiting his trial. The man at the center of it all, quiet, expressionless, and unmoved as the weight of his crimes began to emerge piece by piece. In January of 2007, jury selection began in New Westminster, British Columbia, for the trial of Robert William Pickton. The courtroom was heavily secured. A total of 12 jurors and 2 alternates were chosen, and they were warned that the trial would last for months. Media attention was intense, with international outlets arriving to cover what was quickly becoming one of the most disturbing criminal proceedings in Canadian history. The Crown proceeded with charges for 6 victims: Serena Abotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josbury, Brenda Wolfe, Marnie Fry, and Georgina Papine. The decision to limit the trial to these 6 cases was based on the strength of the forensic evidence. Prosecutors determined that proceeding with all 26 remaining counts at once would be too complex and risked overwhelming the jury. The other 20 charges were stayed under the expectation that, should Picton be acquitted or sentenced with leniency, the Crown could initiate a second trial. The evidence presented was extensive. Over the course of the proceedings, the jury heard from more than 129 witnesses. More than 300 exhibits were introduced. The Crown opened with DNA matches from remains found on the farm, including blood and tissue samples linked to the 6 women. Some of the materials had been found in freezers and buckets, others on clothing, gloves, and tools scattered throughout the property. Forensic analysts testified about how the remains were processed and identified, often having to explain in detail how samples had been extracted from degraded, contaminated, or otherwise unrecognizable materials. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence came from a videotaped interview between Picton and an undercover officer planted in his jail cell. In that footage, Picton claimed he had killed 49 women and that he had been sloppy. He also mentioned his intention to make it an even 50, but said he had been caught before he could do so. The jury watched the tape in silence. The officer, posing as a fellow inmate, gently coaxed Picton into talking, encouraging him to brag. Picton's statements were vague at times and laced with profanity, but prosecutors argued they were damning. Testimony also came from a key witness known in court only as Ms. Anderson, whose identity was protected by a publication ban. She was a former employee at the farm who had lived in one of the trailers during the late 1990s. She testified that she had seen women arrive at the property and never saw them leave. She said Picton often returned from Vancouver with women late at night. She described finding bloodstains, surgical gloves, and women's belongings around the farm. She also described a freezer that Picton warned her never to open. Jurors were also shown a videotaped statement from a woman named Lynn Ellingson who had previously provided a sworn affidavit. She claimed that in the late 1990s she had seen Picton with the body of a woman hanging from a hook in his slaughterhouse. She said that he was covered in blood and that he had told her to leave. Although her credibility was questioned due to past criminal charges and drug use, prosecutors included her testimony as part of a broader narrative pointing to Picton's pattern of behavior. Defense attorneys for Picton argued that their client was not the killer. They claimed that other people who had access to the property could have been responsible. They pointed to the fact that the farm was accessible to numerous individuals during the years in question, including friends, employees, and partygoers. They argued that the presence of DNA on the property did not conclusively prove that Picton had killed anyone. The defense also questioned the reliability of the jailhouse confession, suggesting it had been manipulated or taken out of context. During cross-examination, the defense pressed witnesses on inconsistencies in their memories and drug use. They attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's timeline and accused the investigators of confirmation bias. However, the amount of physical evidence collected from the farm presented a staggering picture: DNA from 33 women found throughout the property, along with personal belongings, photographs, and human remains. As the trial progressed, the jury heard from forensic pathologists who described the state in which the remains were found. In several cases, only partial remains were recovered, sometimes just bone fragments or teeth. The Crown explained that some bodies had been dismembered and processed through meat rendering equipment. Forensic anthropologists described methods used to determine identity from tiny fragments, including mitochondrial DNA testing, which can trace maternal lineage through generations. The trial lasted nearly a year. On December 9, 2007, the jury returned with a verdict. Picton was found guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder. Though the Crown had pursued first-degree charges, the jury found that the killings had occurred, but without the premeditation required for first-degree murder under Canadian law. The judge, Justice James Williams, sentenced Picton to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum sentence allowable under the Canadian Criminal Code at the time. Families of the victims expressed mixed emotions. Some felt relief that Picton had been convicted. Others were devastated that the other 20 charges had not gone to trial. The decision to stay those charges meant that many families would never hear their loved one's name read aloud in court, never see their story told before a jury. For many, the absence of formal recognition deepened the wound. In 2010, a public inquiry was called by the provincial government to examine the failures of the police, particularly in relation to how missing persons reports were handled. The Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, led by Commissioner Wally Oppel, heard testimony from more than 80 witnesses over the course of several months. The final report, released in 2012, concluded that systemic bias, poor coordination between agencies, and a general indifference toward marginalized women had contributed to the failure to apprehend Pickton sooner. The report identified numerous missteps. The Vancouver Police Department and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had failed to share information. Officers dismissed early reports of disappearances, often attributing them to voluntary transience or addiction. Investigative leads were not followed. Witnesses were not properly interviewed. And despite growing evidence that a serial killer might be operating in the downtown east side, resources were not allocated, and warnings from community members went largely unheeded. The inquiry made 63 recommendations, including the creation of a centralized missing persons unit, increased support services for vulnerable populations, and greater accountability within law enforcement agencies. It also called for a public apology. In 2014, the Vancouver Police Department formally apologized for their handling of the case and acknowledged that they had failed. Robert Pickton was transferred from a British Columbia facility to a maximum security prison in Quebec. He has never expressed remorse. In 2016, a book was published under his name titled Pickton in his own words, which was allegedly transcribed by someone claiming to be his friend. The book attempted to cast doubt on his guilt and reassert his innocence. It was immediately condemned by victims' families and pulled from shelves. The federal government moved to prevent inmates from profiting from publications related to their crimes. The Pickton case remains one of the darkest chapters in Canadian criminal history. Dozens of women, many already living on the margins of society, were murdered, and for years, their disappearances were not treated with urgency. The horror of what happened on that farm was not just the brutality of the acts, but how long they went unnoticed, how warnings were ignored, and how silence allowed it all to continue. Today, the remains of the Pickton property have been leveled. The land sits vacant, its soil still marked by the excavation. Families still gather each year to honor the women who vanished. Their names are read aloud during vigils in the downtown east side, where murals and memorials now stand in their memory. Some families still do not have confirmed remains, only the belief that their daughters, sisters, and mothers were among those lost. Robert Pickton will never walk free again, but the legacy of his crimes, the questions they raised, the lives they shattered, and the failures they exposed continue to echo. Not only in courtrooms or inquiry reports, but in the quiet, empty spaces where a woman never came home, where a phone never rang, and where a mother's voice went unheard for far too long. Story 6. The Murder of Carl Bridgewater. It was the afternoon of Wednesday, September 20th, 1978, when a delivery boy named Carl Bridgewater set out on his usual newspaper round in the quiet village of Prestwood, near Starbridge in the West Midlands of England. He was 14 years old, a student at High Park School in Starbridge, and had taken the job to earn a bit of money after school. People who knew him described him as gentle, polite, and dependable, someone who didn't cause trouble and took his responsibilities seriously. That day, as usual, Carl cycled through his route, delivering newspapers to houses scattered across the rural lanes. By around 4 in the afternoon, he reached Yew Tree Farm, a secluded property located off a narrow, winding road. The farm was owned by an elderly couple, Mary and Fred Poole. Fred had recently been hospitalized, leaving Mary home alone. Carl had delivered to the Pooles before and was familiar with the route. But that day, something was different. A neighbor, who had expected her copy of the Express and Star newspaper, noticed it hadn't been delivered. That seemed odd. Later, when Mary Poole returned home around 6 o'clock after visiting her husband at the hospital, she entered the farmhouse and found the back door open. Inside, the house looked disturbed. Then, in the front room, she found Carl Bridgewater lying on the floor. He had been shot in the head at close range. Police were immediately called to the scene and a murder investigation began. It was clear early on that Carl had stumbled upon a burglary in progress. The back door had been forced open and several items inside the home had been moved or tampered with. It looked like someone had broken in, was interrupted by Carl's unexpected arrival, and decided to eliminate the only witness. The murder weapon was identified as a shotgun. Carl had been shot in the head while kneeling or standing close to the gun. There were no signs of a struggle and no sexual assault. His wallet and personal belongings were still on him. It was a cold execution-style killing. The investigation was led by West Midlands Police. In the early days, there was pressure to find a suspect quickly. The murder of a child delivering newspapers had shocked the country. The press coverage was intense, and the police were under enormous scrutiny. Initial efforts focused on known criminals in the area, particularly those with a history of burglary or firearms offenses. But there was little physical evidence at the scene. No fingerprints were lifted that linked to any specific suspect. The shotgun used in the killing was never recovered. Investigators believed the killer had used a stolen weapon and disposed of it quickly afterward. The investigation went on for months with few solid leads. Then, in the summer of 1979, the focus turned to four men who became known as the Bridgewater Four: Patrick Malloy, James Robinson, and cousins Vincent and Michael Hickey. They were all from the Birmingham area and had been previously involved in petty crimes and burglaries. The Hickey cousins were in their early 20s at the time, while Malloy and Robinson were older. The police connected them to a recent armed robbery at a farmhouse called the Holloway Farm, which had some similarities to the Yew Tree Farm break-in. That connection became the basis for their interest in the four men. Police brought them in for questioning, hoping to find some link to Carl Bridgewater's murder. During intense and lengthy police interviews, many of which were conducted without legal representation, statements were obtained from the suspects. The most significant came from Patrick Malloy, who eventually signed a statement that implied he had been present during the Yew Tree Farm incident. His statement, however, did not say he had seen who shot Carl Bridgewater. It was more vague, suggesting he had heard a bang and thought it was a shotgun. That statement became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. It was used to implicate all four men in the murder, even though there was no forensic evidence linking any of them to the crime scene. The prosecution argued that the four had gone to Yew Tree Farm intending to rob it, that Carl had walked in on them, and that one of them had shot him to prevent identification. The trial began at Stafford Crown Court in November 1979. The prosecution presented Malloy's statement as evidence of guilt for all four men. They also relied on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony putting the men in the area, though much of it was contested or inconsistent. On November 26, 1979, the jury returned its verdict. Vincent Hickey, Michael Hickey, and James Robinson were all convicted of murder. Patrick Malloy, whose statement had formed the basis of the charges, was convicted of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The others received life sentences. From the moment the verdict was read, there were doubts. The defense had argued that the statements had been coerced, that the men had been worn down during long periods of interrogation. There were no fingerprints, no murder weapon, and no eyewitnesses connecting them directly to the killing. But in the absence of better suspects, the case was closed. In prison, the convicted men maintained their innocence. Michael Hickey was only 16 years old when the murder happened. His cousin Vincent, along with Robinson and Malloy, insisted they had not been anywhere near Yew Tree Farm that day. Over time, their claims started to gain traction, especially as questions were raised about how the statements had been obtained and whether due process had been followed. Patrick Malloy died in prison in 1981, just 2 years after the trial. He had reportedly expressed regret about signing the statement, saying he had been confused and pressured. His death only deepened the mystery and added urgency to those who were beginning to look more closely into whether the wrong men had been convicted. As the years passed, doubts about the case grew louder. Journalists, legal experts, and advocacy groups began to examine the evidence or lack of it and highlighted serious concerns about the investigation and trial process. The public, once convinced that the killers had been caught, began to ask questions. And behind it all, the family of Carl Bridgewater was still waiting for justice. His parents, who had remained largely private in the wake of his death, never stopped hoping that the full truth would one day come out. The murder of a 14-year-old boy delivering newspapers had shocked an entire country. But as time went on, it became clear that the story was far from over. In the early months following the convictions, the case of Carl Bridgewater faded from the front pages. But behind the scenes, a quiet resistance was forming. It began not with legal teams or public campaigns, but with the families of the convicted men, particularly Vincent and Michael Hickey's relatives, who refused to accept the court's conclusion. They began collecting transcripts, reviewing police interviews, and contacting anyone who might help them understand what had really happened inside those interrogation rooms. By the mid-1980s, momentum began to build. A former detective named Chris Mullen, who had become a journalist and later a member of Parliament, received a letter from the Hickey family. They asked him to look into the case, hoping he might find inconsistencies that could be taken further. Mullen had already played a role in exposing the wrongful convictions in the Birmingham 6 case. He agreed to take a closer look. What he found disturbed him. The statements that led to the convictions were riddled with problems. Patrick Malloy's confession, which had been presented as the linchpin of the prosecution's case, had not implicated anyone directly in the murder. Instead, it had been shaped by police officers during a long and largely undocumented interview process. Malloy had signed statements after multiple sessions during which no solicitor had been present. The words in the statement were formal and structured nothing like the way Malloy normally spoke. Mullen also noted that no recordings had been made of the interviews, even though this was increasingly becoming best practice in major investigations. There were few contemporaneous notes. The only records came from typed statements produced after the fact, signed by suspects under stress, and often after hours of questioning. By the late 1980s, Mullen had gathered enough material to start writing publicly about the case. In 1989, he published an article in the New Statesman outlining the serious flaws in the prosecution's case and the likelihood that the Bridgewater Four were innocent. Shortly after, Granada Television's World in Action broadcast a detailed documentary about the case, drawing national attention to the growing doubts surrounding the convictions. In Parliament, questions were raised about whether the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad had acted improperly. The unit had already come under scrutiny for its tactics in other high-profile cases, including the Birmingham 6 and the Tottenham 3. Accusations of fabricated evidence, coerced confessions, and abuse of suspects were beginning to surface across multiple cases handled by the same officers. As public pressure mounted, the legal system was forced to respond. In 1991, the Home Secretary referred the case to the Court of Appeal. But despite the mounting evidence of procedural failure, the court upheld the convictions. The judges concluded that while the police methods may have been flawed, there was still enough to justify a guilty verdict. The decision was devastating to the families who had campaigned for over a decade, but they refused to give up. Behind the scenes, solicitors and campaigners began working on new applications to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which was formed in 1997 to investigate possible miscarriages of justice. Then, in 1997, a breakthrough came. The Criminal Cases Review Commission conducted a full re-examination of the evidence. During their investigation, they uncovered crucial new information. Among the most significant findings was that Patrick Malloy had repeatedly denied any involvement in the murder during the early stages of his detention. These denials had not been disclosed at the original trial. Instead, the jury had been presented only with his final signed statement, which appeared to implicate him. The commission also discovered that the same officers who had extracted the statements in the Bridgewater case had been involved in multiple other wrongful convictions. In particular, the behavior of Detective Chief Inspector George Reed and Detective Sergeant John Perkins came under scrutiny. Both had been part of the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad and were later discredited in other cases. There were also concerns about the forensic aspect of the case. At trial, the prosecution had suggested that a shotgun stolen during a separate burglary could have been the murder weapon, and that the four men had access to it. But this theory was never supported by any direct evidence. The weapon had never been recovered and ballistics analysis had been inconclusive. Despite this, the prosecution had used the theory to suggest a chain of events that placed the defendants at the scene. In July 1997, the Criminal Cases Review Commission formally referred the case back to the Court of Appeal. This time, the evidence was overwhelming. On February 21, 1997, nearly 2 decades after the murder of Carl Bridgewater, the Court of Appeal quashed the convictions of Vincent Hickey, Michael Hickey, and James Robinson. The court ruled that the trial had been unfair due to the reliance on Malloy's unreliable statement and the failure to disclose key evidence. The decision came too late for Patrick Malloy. He had died 16 years earlier, still imprisoned for a crime he may not have committed. In the courtroom, the surviving 3 men were vindicated, but there was little celebration. They had spent 18 years in prison, most of it under the stigma of being child killers. Their lives had been irreversibly damaged. After the ruling, Lord Justice Rock stated plainly that the convictions were unsafe, and that the evidence presented at the original trial should never have been allowed. The judgment was a damning indictment of the police investigation and the prosecution's handling of the case. In the months that followed, questions turned toward accountability. How could such a miscarriage of justice have occurred? Who was responsible for the manipulation of evidence, the withholding of key facts, and the coercion of vulnerable suspects? Formal inquiries into the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad revealed systemic issues, and the unit was eventually disbanded. The Home Office later paid out compensation to the 3 surviving men. Vincent Hickey received over £1 million. Michael Hickey and James Robinson received similar settlements. But the money could not return the years they had lost, nor could it erase the trauma of incarceration or the public vilification they had endured. For the family of Carl Bridgewater, the decision brought no peace. The quashing of the convictions left them in a terrible limbo. After almost 20 years, the truth about who had killed their son remained unknown. The police were left with a reopened case and no viable suspects. Leads had long gone cold. Witnesses had died. Evidence had degraded. In a rare public statement, Carl's parents expressed their heartbreak. They had believed for years that justice had been served. Now, they were being asked to accept that the men convicted of killing their son had not done it and that the real murderer had never been caught. The grief that had defined their lives since 1978 now reopened with a new kind of pain: uncertainty. Although the case was officially reopened, no new charges were ever brought. The investigation into Carl's murder remains open, but there have been no arrests since the Bridgewater 4 were cleared. Over the years, various names have emerged as possible suspects, including individuals linked to the Holloway Farm robbery. But none have been conclusively tied to the killing. In time, the Bridgewater case became a symbol not just of a tragic murder, but of a justice system that had failed at nearly every level. It highlighted the dangers of relying on confessions obtained without oversight, the consequences of police misconduct, and the human cost of wrongful imprisonment. But beneath those headlines, there is still the image of a boy with a bicycle and a newspaper bag doing his job on a quiet September afternoon. A child who crossed the threshold of a farmhouse and never came out. A life that ended violently without reason and without warning. And a question that still haunts everyone who has followed this case. Who killed Carl Bridgewater? And why have they never been found? In the years following the quashing of the convictions in 1997, public attention began to shift toward accountability not just for the wrongful imprisonment of 3 men, but for the broader institutional failures that allowed it to happen. The West Midlands Serious Crime Squad, whose officers had played a central role in extracting the now discredited statements, became the subject of deeper scrutiny. While the squad had already been disbanded in 1989 after mounting allegations of misconduct in other cases, The Bridgewater case highlighted how systemic those issues truly were. Investigations into the unit's practices revealed patterns of coerced confessions, failure to record interviews, and manipulation of evidence. In the Bridgewater case, there had been no audio recordings of the critical interviews, and key denials made by Patrick Malloy were omitted from the material presented to the court. These were not isolated oversights, they were part of a broader culture where securing convictions often appeared to outweigh the pursuit of truth. Despite the revelations, none of the officers involved in the original investigation faced criminal charges. Some had already retired or left the force by the time inquiries began in earnest. Internal disciplinary proceedings were considered, but the passage of time combined with the lack of preserved records made it difficult to pursue any formal sanctions. For the families of those wrongly imprisoned, this lack of accountability became a fresh wound. The state had acknowledged that a miscarriage of justice had occurred, but no one was being held responsible for it. Meanwhile, the reopened investigation into Carl Bridgewater's murder struggled to gain traction. With no new forensic evidence and no eyewitnesses coming forward, detectives were left to re-examine old files and re-interview individuals who had been mentioned during the original inquiries. One of the names that resurfaced was Bert Spencer, a former neighbor of the Poole family who had lived near Yew Tree Farm at the time of the murder. Spencer had been a topic of interest in the early stages of the original investigation. He had access to a shotgun, had experience with firearms, and drove a blue Vauxhall Victor, a car similar to one reported near the farm around the time of the murder. He also bore a physical resemblance to one of the original artist's impressions circulated by police. However, he had a solid alibi at the time and was never charged. Years later, Spencer was convicted of a separate murder. In 1979, less than a year after Carl's death, he shot and killed his friend Hubert Wilkes at point-blank range with a shotgun. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for that crime. The similarities between the two shootings, the use of a shotgun, the rural setting, the suddenness of the act prompted some to wonder whether Carl's murder had been mistakenly attributed to the wrong people from the start. In 2016, Spencer re-entered public discussion when journalist David James Smith conducted a series of interviews with him for a Channel 4 documentary titled Interview with a Murderer. The program explored the possibility that Spencer had been involved in Carl Bridgewater's death. Though Spencer continued to deny any involvement, his demeanor and inconsistent responses raised questions. At one point during the interviews, he made statements that appeared evasive or contradictory, particularly when confronted with evidence about his proximity to the scene. Nevertheless, no fresh evidence emerged to link Spencer definitively to the murder. Law enforcement authorities stated that he had been thoroughly investigated at the time and that no admissible evidence had ever been found to justify charging him in connection with Carl's death. The documentary reignited public interest but did not alter the official status of the case. By the early 2000s, all avenues of active investigation had been exhausted. West Mercia Police, who had inherited responsibility for the case after the dissolution of the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad, maintained that the murder of Carl Bridgewater remained open, though inactive. Detectives stated that they would follow up on any new leads, but acknowledged that the passing of time had made it increasingly unlikely that any resolution would be found. The families of those wrongly convicted continued to rebuild their lives after release. Vincent Hickey, who had been one of the most vocal campaigners during his incarceration, remained outspoken about miscarriages of justice until his death in 2013. Michael Hickey, who had entered prison at just 16 years old, struggled with mental health issues upon release. He eventually settled in Nottinghamshire and lived quietly, largely avoiding the public eye. James Robinson, the third man whose conviction had been overturned, also experienced long-term consequences from his imprisonment. All three men received compensation from the Home Office, but the payments could not undo the years lost or repair the damage done to their reputations and relationships. For the Bridgewater family, the decades following Carl's death were marked by silence and grief. They rarely spoke to the media, choosing to mourn privately. In one of their few public statements, they expressed their heartbreak over the collapse of the case and their hope that one day someone would come forward with the truth. But no one ever did. As of today, no one has ever been charged or convicted for the murder of Carl Bridgewater. The farmhouse at Yew Tree Farm remains a quiet and ordinary structure in the English countryside, bearing silent witness to a crime that shocked the nation. The case stands as one of the most haunting unsolved murders in British criminal history, a story of a boy who went out to deliver newspapers and never came home, and of a justice system that compounded tragedy with error. The legacy of the case is felt not only through the lives it shattered, but through the reforms it helped catalyze. The establishment of the Criminal Cases Review Commission in 1997 was, in part, a response to cases like Carl Bridgewater's, a recognition that the appeals system alone was not sufficient to correct wrongful convictions. The commission has since played a role in overturning dozens of unsafe verdicts, offering a measure of hope in an otherwise flawed system. But for Carl, there can be no justice retroactively applied. The child whose photograph once stared out from front pages across the country remains fixed in time, 14 years old, on a bicycle with a satchel full of newspapers slung over his shoulder. His murder remains a wound on the national conscience, made deeper by the failures that followed it. You and I may never know who pulled the trigger that day in September of 1978. We may never know what they saw in Carl Bridgewater that made them decide that he could not be allowed to leave that farmhouse alive. But what we do know, what the record makes clear, is that mistakes were made and lives were ruined, all in the name of swift justice. And in the quiet that now surrounds this case, amid the yellowing pages of old court transcripts and the faded memories of witnesses long gone, that silence speaks louder than ever. Story 7. The Murder of Breonna Taylor. It was shortly after midnight on March 13, 2020, when the stillness inside apartment number 4 at 3003 Springfield Drive in Louisville, Kentucky, was shattered. In that apartment, 26-year-old Breonna Taylor was asleep alongside her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker. The two had spent the evening watching movies and had eventually fallen asleep in bed together. Neither of them had any warning that their lives were about to be upended. At exactly 12:40 a.m., officers from the Louisville Metro Police Department executed a search warrant at Breonna's apartment. The warrant was part of a larger narcotics investigation centered on Jamarcus Glover, a man who had previously dated Breonna and whom the police believed was using her apartment to receive drugs or stash money. According to official records, police had been surveilling Glover and other individuals for some time, and Breonna's name had come up during the course of that investigation. Authorities claimed they had reason to believe Glover was using Breonna's apartment to hide narcotics proceeds. Surveillance had shown Glover visiting Breonna's apartment in January, and there were allegedly packages being delivered there. Records show that police obtained a no-knock search warrant on March 12th, allowing them to enter the apartment without announcing themselves. However, according to later statements, officers claimed they did knock and announce before entering. What happened in those next few moments remains disputed to this day. Kenneth Walker would later testify that he and Breonna had been asleep when they heard loud banging at the door. Believing it was a break-in, Kenneth grabbed his legally owned handgun and fired a single shot when the door burst open. That shot struck Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly in the leg. In response, 3 officers, Jonathan Mattingly, Brett Hankison, and Miles Cosgrove, returned fire. In total, they fired 32 rounds into the apartment. Breonna Taylor was struck 6 times and died in the hallway. She did not fire a weapon. She was unarmed and had not committed any crime. In the immediate aftermath, Kenneth Walker called 911, frantic and confused. "Somebody kicked in the door and shot my girlfriend," he told the dispatcher. Officers detained him at the scene, and he was initially charged with attempted murder of a police officer. Inside the apartment, no drugs were found. None of the occupants had a criminal record that would have justified the level of force used that night. Breonna's death was recorded as a homicide by the Jefferson County coroner. The police reported that they had knocked and announced themselves multiple times before entering, but this was disputed by Kenneth and by several neighbors. One neighbor, Aaron Sarpy, initially said he did not hear officers announce themselves. Later, he changed his account in an interview with internal investigators, stating that he did hear them identify themselves. However, Over a dozen other neighbors said they heard loud banging but no announcement. The conflicting testimonies would become one of the most debated aspects of the case. The search warrant itself also came under scrutiny. It had been approved by Jefferson Circuit Judge Mary Shaw, based on an affidavit that connected Brianna's apartment to the drug investigation through Glover's alleged use of her address. However, postal inspectors later said there was no evidence of suspicious packages being delivered to Brianna's home. The justification for the warrant was increasingly questioned by legal experts and the public alike. In the days following the shooting, Brianna's name was largely absent from national headlines. Initial media coverage was minimal, and it wasn't until months later after the deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery that her story gained widespread attention. As protests erupted across the country in response to police killings of unarmed black individuals, Brianna's name became a rallying cry. Her mother, Tamika Palmer, would later say that the silence in those first weeks was one of the most painful parts of the ordeal. She had to learn the details of her daughter's death slowly, in pieces, as the official narrative evolved. "They killed her," she told reporters. "They killed her and nobody said anything." Kenneth Walker's charges were eventually dropped. Jefferson Commonwealth's attorney Tom Wine initially pursued the attempted murder charge but withdrew it in May 2020, citing new evidence. This decision was influenced in part by the 911 call and public pressure, as well as the lack of clear justification for the original raid. Internal investigations began to examine whether any policies had been violated in the planning and execution of the warrant. The LMPD's Professional Standards Unit launched a review, and the FBI opened a parallel civil rights investigation. Public outrage intensified, and the city of Louisville faced mounting calls for accountability. By June, the Louisville Metro Council had passed Brianna's Law, which banned no-knock warrants within city limits and required officers to wear body cameras during all search warrant executions. The officers involved in Brianna's death had not been wearing body cameras during the raid, leading to significant gaps in the record of what occurred. Despite these legislative changes, none of the officers were immediately charged in connection with Brianna's death. Brett Hankison was fired from the department in June 2020. In his termination letter, Interim Police Chief Robert Schroeder wrote that Hankison had displayed an extreme indifference to the value of human life when he fired 10 shots blindly into the apartment and neighboring units. Still, many in the community saw this as insufficient. The other two officers, Mattingly and Cosgrove, remained on the force at that time. As the summer wore on, protests in Louisville and across the United States grew louder. Demonstrators painted Brianna's name on city streets, held vigils, and demanded justice. Her image appeared on magazine covers, murals, and banners. But behind the slogans and headlines was a grieving family struggling to understand how a young woman who had committed no crime and posed no threat could be killed in her own home by those sworn to protect her. Brianna had worked as an emergency room technician. She had dreams of becoming a nurse, of buying a house, of starting a family. Her friends described her as nurturing and full of life. She had spent the early months of the pandemic working long shifts, helping patients in distress. Her death felt like a betrayal not just of her, but of the ideals she had committed her life to. The legal process, however, moved slowly, and as the months passed, the public's demands for accountability turned to questions. What did the police know before the raid? Who signed off on the warrant? And why had no one been held criminally responsible for her death? These questions would only grow louder in the months to come. In the weeks that followed the shooting, the Louisville Metro Police Department found itself under a microscope. Behind closed doors, internal affairs officers began collecting statements, combing through dispatch logs, and reconstructing the timeline of what had happened that night. But even before facts could fully settle, the narrative had begun fracturing, pulled in different directions by officers' testimonies, forensics, and quiet inconsistencies that refused to align. Detective Joshua Janes, the officer who had sworn out the affidavit for the search warrant, became one of the earliest focal points in the formal review. His sworn statement claimed that he had verified through a U.S. postal inspector that packages potentially tied to narcotics activity were being sent to Breonna Taylor's apartment. But that claim was soon challenged. Tony Gooden, a U.S. postal inspector based in Louisville, publicly stated that his office had been consulted by the police earlier in the investigation and had found no evidence of suspicious packages being delivered to her address. This directly contradicted what Janes had included in the affidavit that had secured the warrant. When questioned later, Janes clarified that he had been told about the packages by a fellow officer who said he had spoken to a postal inspector. Janes had not independently verified the information himself before including it in the warrant. That misstep would later be described by internal investigators as both reckless and misleading. In a separate interview with the Public Integrity Unit, Janes acknowledged that he had not personally confirmed the postal information. It was a detail that, on paper, may have seemed minor. But in the chain of events that led to Breonna Taylor's death, it mattered. The probable cause for the warrant hinged on that connection to drug trafficking activity. And without it, the legal foundation for the forced entry into her home began to crumble. Meanwhile, questions also began to surface about how the raid had been assigned and planned. The operation, targeting multiple locations associated with Jamarcus Glover, had originally listed the Taylor residence as a soft target, a location believed to be less risky. Officers had been instructed to execute the search warrant at her apartment after others had already been served across town. Yet, by the time officers arrived at her door, they were carrying out the operation largely disconnected from the rest of the team. The coordination had broken down. According to LMPD documents, the group that conducted the raid on Breonna Taylor's apartment had not attended the main pre-operational briefing that had outlined the objectives and risk levels for each location. That meant that officers Jonathan Mattingly, Brett Hankison, and Miles Cosgrove were acting with limited intelligence and without the most up-to-date information on the investigation's progress from earlier that evening. Audio from police radio communications later revealed that after the shooting, a series of disjointed calls and updates filled the airwaves, officers requesting ambulances, reporting shots fired, and attempting to secure the scene. One officer can be heard saying, "We need EMS ASAP," followed by confusion about where to direct them. Emergency medical services were staged nearby, but due to protocol, they had been instructed to wait until officers secured the scene. As a result, no paramedics entered the apartment for several critical minutes after the shooting had ended. The delay was not a violation of policy, but it underscored the procedural failings that had plagued the operation. Breonna Taylor was still alive when officers found her in the hallway. She had been shot multiple times, but there was no clear evidence that any life-saving measures were attempted. The investigative file later confirmed that she was pronounced dead at the scene. While the scene was being processed, Kenneth Walker was taken into custody and interviewed by detectives. In a recorded statement, he explained that he and Breonna had not known who was at the door and that he had fired a single warning shot, believing it was a home invasion. He repeatedly asked if Breonna was okay, unaware at that point that she had already died. His gun was recovered at the scene, and forensic testing later confirmed that the bullet that struck Sergeant Mattingly in the thigh had been fired from Walker's legally owned firearm. Ballistics analysis conducted by the FBI later found that the fatal shot that killed Breonna Taylor was likely fired by Miles Cosgrove. The FBI's firearms examiners used trajectory analysis, witness accounts, and shell casing locations to determine that Cosgrove had fired at least 16 rounds, including the one that struck her in the chest. That bullet passed through her pulmonary artery, causing massive internal bleeding. Detective Brett Hankison, who had fired 10 rounds from outside the apartment through a covered window and sliding glass door, did not hit Breonna. However, 3 of his bullets entered a neighboring apartment where a man, a pregnant woman, and a child were sleeping. No one was injured in that unit, but the decision to fire blindly into a home became a central issue in both the internal investigation and later criminal proceedings. As public scrutiny intensified, the Attorney General of Kentucky, Daniel Cameron, announced that his office would lead the criminal inquiry into the case. The decision was made after questions were raised about the independence of the LMPD's internal affairs process. Cameron, who had taken office just months before, promised a thorough and impartial review. On September 23, 2020, a Jefferson County grand jury indicted Brett Hankison not for Breonna Taylor's death, but on 3 counts of wanton endangerment for the bullets that entered the neighboring apartment. The charges carried a maximum sentence of 5 years per count. Neither Miles Cosgrove nor Jonathan Mattingly were indicted. In his public statement, Cameron said that Cosgrove and Mattingly had been justified in returning fire because Kenneth Walker had shot first. The announcement ignited protests across Louisville and in cities around the country. Demonstrators gathered outside the courthouse, chanting Breonna's name and demanding accountability. That night, 2 police officers were shot during demonstrations in downtown Louisville. Both survived. The city was placed under a state of emergency and the National Guard was deployed to maintain order. The grand jury proceedings themselves became a point of controversy. One of the jurors later filed a motion with the court asking to be allowed to speak publicly, stating that the charges presented had not reflected the full scope of the evidence. After a judge granted the request, 2 grand jurors came forward to say that prosecutors had never offered them the option to indict for homicide. They had only been presented with potential charges related to Hankison's conduct. In response to public pressure, Attorney General Cameron released over 15 hours of audio recordings from the grand jury proceedings. Legal experts and civil rights attorneys combed through the materials, looking for omissions or misrepresentations. The recordings revealed that the jurors had asked pointed questions about other possible charges, but were told that the law did not support them in this case. In the months that followed, additional investigations continued at the federal level. The Department of Justice launched its own review examining not only the shooting itself but the broader patterns of policing in Louisville. The city, meanwhile, reached a civil settlement with the Taylor family. On September 15, 2020, the city of Louisville agreed to pay $12 million to Breonna's estate. As part of the settlement, the city also committed to a series of police reforms, including changes to how warrants are approved, the use of body cameras, and the establishment of an early warning system to identify officers with repeated complaints. Mayor Greg Fisher called the settlement historic, and Breonna's mother, Tamika Palmer, stood beside attorneys as the agreement was announced. But she also made clear that the money was not justice. "We're not going to stop until we get the truth," she said. Behind the headlines and the legal wrangling, a deeper question remained. How had so many layers of oversight, judicial, procedural, and administrative, failed to prevent the death of a young woman in her own home? The answer, as it slowly emerged, lay in a tangled network of assumptions, shortcuts, and silence. Officers had relied on second-hand information. Supervisors had approved warrants without asking hard questions. Tactical decisions had been made without the full picture. And through it all, the human cost had remained constant, silent, and irreversible. Breonna Taylor had not been the target of the investigation. She had not been charged with any crime, and yet she had paid the price for a system that had assumed too much and questioned too little. As the months unfolded, the case of Breonna Taylor continued to deepen, not just in complexity, but in consequence. In the absence of criminal charges related directly to her death, federal investigators began to pull back layers that had gone unexamined in the rush of initial inquiries. What they found would ultimately reframe the entire operation not as a tragic miscalculation, but as a pattern of misconduct that had been allowed to grow unchecked. In April of 2021, the Department of Justice quietly launched a civil pattern or practice investigation into the Louisville Metro Police Department. This type of inquiry, rare and reserved for systemic concerns, examined whether officers regularly used excessive force, conducted illegal searches, or engaged in racially discriminatory practices. Investigators spoke with community members, reviewed thousands of internal documents, and analyzed years of body camera footage and arrest data. The results would not be announced for 2 more years, but the process ran parallel to a second, more urgent federal probe, one that focused directly on Breonna's case. That criminal investigation, conducted by the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, sought to answer a narrower question. Had any law enforcement officials violated federal statutes in the lead-up to, during, or after the raid on Breonna's apartment? By the summer of 2022, federal prosecutors had gathered enough evidence to act. On August 4th, current and former officers were federally charged in connection with the warrant and subsequent raid. These charges were not issued lightly. According to Attorney General Merrick Garland, the indictment alleged that members of the LMPD's Place-Based Investigations Unit had falsified key information in the search warrant affidavit, conspired to cover up their actions after the raid, and violated Breonna's civil rights under color of law. The officers named were Joshua Janes, Kelly Goodlett, Kyle Meany, and Brett Hankison. Each faced different charges, but together their conduct painted a damning portrait of institutional failure and deliberate deception. Janes and Meany were accused of knowingly including false and misleading statements in the affidavit used to justify the warrant. Specifically, the indictment stated that they had claimed a U.S. Postal inspector had confirmed that packages tied to drug activity were being delivered to Breonna's apartment, a claim that, as federal investigators confirmed, was entirely untrue. They had never spoken with the inspector, and no such packages had ever been identified. Kelly Goodlett, another detective in the Place-Based Investigations Unit, was not initially named in the public announcement, but her role would soon come into focus. She later pleaded guilty to one count of conspiracy, admitting under oath that she and Janes had met in Janes' garage after the shooting and agreed to fabricate a story to justify the false information in the warrant. Goodlett told investigators that she and Janes had knowingly relied on an unverified tip and had later conspired to mislead investigators during the internal review. Her cooperation would become a crucial turning point. In court documents, prosecutors alleged that Janes and Goodlett had added the false claim about packages in order to bolster the warrant's chances of being approved. Without that detail, they believed the connection between Breonna's apartment and the drug investigation would have been too tenuous. Janes had previously been fired by the LMPD for his role in the faulty affidavit, but these new charges elevated the matter from departmental misconduct to federal conspiracy. Kyle Meany, a sergeant and supervisor in the unit, was charged with approving the warrant despite knowing that the affidavit contained false information. According to the indictment, Meany also misled federal investigators after the shooting, telling them that officers had been diligent in verifying the information used to justify the search. Brett Hankison, already known for his firing and prior indictment at the state level, now faced separate federal charges. But these were not related to the bullets that struck Breonna. Rather, they addressed the rounds he fired blindly into a neighboring apartment. The federal case accused him of depriving the residents of that apartment of their civil rights by endangering their lives without justification. The charges reflected a broader interpretation of harm, one not limited to those who were physically struck, but encompassing anyone placed at unreasonable risk by law enforcement's conduct. In the year that followed, these cases moved slowly through the federal court system. Janes and Meany pleaded not guilty. Goodlett's plea deal included a cooperation agreement, and her testimony provided key corroboration of the steps taken to falsify the affidavit. Hankison also pleaded not guilty. Each of these proceedings was separate from the state-level decisions that had failed to produce charges directly tied to Breonna's death. But for the first time, there was a formal legal acknowledgement that the search of her apartment had been based on falsehood. In March of 2023, the Department of Justice released the findings of its 2-year investigation into the Louisville Metro Police Department as a whole. The report was sweeping and unflinching. It concluded that the LMPD routinely engaged in a pattern of unconstitutional conduct, which included unlawful stops, discriminatory policing, and the use of excessive force. The department, according to the DOJ, had failed to hold officers accountable and had allowed systemic problems to persist for years. Specific to Breonna's case, the report noted that the department had relied on uncorroborated and speculative information when seeking warrants and that supervisors had not adequately reviewed or questioned those submissions. The raid on Brianna's apartment was described as a culmination of failures that reflected broader dysfunction within the unit and the department at large. In response to the report, the city of Louisville entered into negotiations with the DOJ to establish a consent decree, a legally binding agreement that would require sweeping reforms and federal oversight. Mayor Craig Greenberg, who had taken office earlier that year, publicly committed to cooperating with the process. For many in the community, though, the announcements brought little comfort. The damage had already been done. Reforms could not bring Brianna back. By the end of 2023, the legal landscape around Brianna's case had shifted in ways that were once unimaginable. While no officer had been convicted for her killing, federal prosecutors had secured admissions of wrongdoing that directly implicated law enforcement in the chain of events that led to her death. Brianna's family continued to advocate for full accountability, attending court hearings and speaking at public events. Her mother, Tamika Palmer, remained a central figure in the national conversation about police reform and racial justice. At a forum in Washington, she said softly, "She was more than a name on a poster. She had dreams. She had plans. And none of this should have happened." The apartment where Brianna died was eventually vacated and later renovated. The hallway where she collapsed remained etched in the memories of those who had seen the crime scene photographs: bullet holes in the walls, shattered glass underfoot, and blood pooled in silence. In the years since, her story has been taught in law schools, cited in legislative hearings, and spoken aloud in countless demonstrations. But beyond the headlines and courtrooms, it has also lived on in quieter places, in hospital wings where her former colleagues still work, in the hands of young nurses who wear badges with her name, and in the homes of families who now ask harder questions about the systems meant to protect them. Breonna Taylor's life was not defined by the way it ended. But the way it ended forced a nation to confront what had long been ignored: how easily justice can be obscured by procedure, how truth can be bent by those entrusted to uphold it, and how silence, when institutionalized, becomes a form of violence all its own. In the end, the most haunting part of her story may not be what was done, but what wasn't undone. Because for all the laws passed, all the policies revised, and all the statements made, the one thing that could never be returned was the quiet future of a woman who had simply gone to bed one night, unaware that her name would come to mean something far larger than she could have known.